There are birthdays you remember because of the cake, the candles, the people who show up just to see you smile. And then there's the 10th day of October in the Hidden Leaf Village, a day when the streets fill with lanterns and drums, when families gather in the square to celebrate the anniversary of a great victory, when an entire village throws a festival in the name of the 4th Hokage's sacrifice. And there's a boy who spends that same day alone. If you've been with us since the beginning of this channel, you already know his name. But tonight, we're not looking at the Naruto Uzumaki the world will one day fear and respect in equal measure. Tonight, we're looking at an 8-year-old boy sitting on the edge of a rusted swing set outside the Konoha orphanage's old playground, watching fireworks bloom over rooftops he isn't welcome beneath. Before you keep watching, if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what happens tonight sets two lonely boys on a collision course that the entire shinobi world isn't ready for. Now, let's begin. The swing creaked under Naruto's weight, a slow metallic groan that matched the ache sitting somewhere behind his ribs. Above him, the sky cracked open in gold and violet, another firework, another cheer rising up from the crowded main street 3 blocks away. He could hear laughter carried on the wind. He could smell grilled skewers of chicken and roasted corn. He could hear a street vendor calling out over the noise, offering hot barley tea to ward off the autumn chill. He wasn't invited to any of it. He never was. Happy birthday, Naruto, he muttered to himself, kicking at the dirt beneath the swing. His voice came out flat, the kind of flat that comes from saying something so many times it stops meaning anything. Nobody answered him. Nobody ever did. 6 years old was the first birthday he remembered clearly, the first time he understood, really understood, that something about him made grown-ups flinch when they looked at him too long. He didn't know why back then. He still didn't fully know why now, at 8, even though he'd started noticing patterns. The way conversations died when he walked into a shop, the way mothers pulled their children a little closer when he passed. The way Iruka-sensei was the only adult at the academy who ever looked him in the eye without something ugly hiding behind his expression. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, and stared out at the fireworks like they belonged to some other village, some other world that had accidentally let him glimpse it through a cracked door. Some birthday, he whispered, somewhere in the depths of his mind, a place he didn't understand yet, a place that felt like sewage pipes and flooded stone corridors. Something stirred. Something ancient. Something that had been sealed away inside him since the day he was born, on this very same date, 8 years ago. Naruto didn't know its name. Not yet. He only knew that sometimes, in his dreams, he heard something growl. Tonight would be different. Tonight, for the first time, that growl would answer a whisper from somewhere very, very far away. Now let's travel east. Past the forests, past the rivers, past the border checkpoints where leaf and sand shinobi eye each other with practiced neutrality, all the way to the edge of the land of wind, where the sun doesn't set so much as it simply burns out behind endless dunes. Sunagakure. The hidden sand village. Here, there are no festivals tonight. No fireworks. No fanfare. Here, in a modest house near the edge of the shinobi district, a boy with hair the color of dried blood sits alone in his room, staring at a ceiling he has memorized every crack of. His name is Gaara. He is, give or take a year, the same age as the blonde boy sitting on that swing set hundreds of miles away. And though either of them knows it yet, they share more in common than either could imagine. Gaara's room is spare. A bed. A shelf with a few toys he never plays with, gifts given more out of obligation than affection. A window that looks out over the sand-colored rooftops of the village, painted orange now by the dying sun. He sits cross-legged on his bed, arms wrapped loosely around the stuffed bear with a stitched-on smile, its fabric worn thin from years of being clutched too tightly during nights when sleep refuses to come. Sleep. That word means something different for Gaara than it does for other children. For Gaara, sleep is dangerous. The door creaks open, and a young man steps inside, soft-spoken, gentle-eyed, with sandy hair swept beneath a forehead protector and a scarf loose around his neck. This is Yashimaru. Gaara's uncle, Gaara's guardian. And, though the boy doesn't yet know the weight hiding behind the word, supposedly, the only person in the world who loves him. You should be asleep, Yashimaru said softly, setting down a small tray on the nightstand, a cup of warm chamomile tea, steam curling gently into the cool night air. No wine, no stronger drink to numb an aching night, not that anyone in this house would ever offer such a thing to a child. Just tea, plain and warm, the way it always was. I don't want to, Gaara murmured, not looking up. Because of the dreams? Gaara's grip on the stuffed bear tightened. He didn't answer. Yashimura sat at the edge of the bed, careful, deliberate, the way one might sit beside something fragile that could shatter, or something dangerous that could strike. You know I worry about you, he said. You don't rest. Not really rest. Even when your eyes are closed. It's not my fault, Gaara said, and for a moment, something flickered behind his pale eyes, not quite anger, not quite fear, but something in between. Something that had no name yet. I know, Yashimura said. And though his voice was soft, though his hand rested gently on Gaara's shoulder, there was a practiced quality to the gesture, the motion of someone performing affection rather than feeling it freely. Gaara couldn't tell the difference yet. Not tonight. That realization, the one that would eventually break something inside this boy, was still years away. Drink your tea, Yashimura said, standing. And try to rest. Even a little. The door closed. The room fell quiet. Gaara sat alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle faintly against the window glass, and dreaded, as he dreaded every single night, the moment his eyes would finally grow too heavy to stay open. Because something inside him never slept. Something inside him watched. Let's pause here for a second, because I want you to sit with something. 2 boys. 2 villages. Hundreds of miles apart. Neither one has ever heard the other's name. Neither one has ever seen the other's face. And yet, tonight, for reasons neither of them will understand until much, much later, their stories are about to tangle together for the first time. Because deep inside each of these boys, sealed away by ninjutsu older than either village's founding, something ancient is stirring. Something that remembers. If you've watched enough of our other What If series, you already know their names. Inside Naruto, the 9-tailed fox. Kurama. Inside Gaara, the 1-tailed Shikaku. 2 of the 9 legendary tailed beasts, born from the same ancient chakra source thousands of years ago, split apart by a sage whose name has become legend. 9 siblings, torn from one body, scattered across a continent, sealed one by one into human vessels who never asked for the burden. Most of the time, these beasts sleep. Most of the time, they rage. Most of the time, they resent the cages built around them. But tonight, something different happens. Tonight, for the first time in years, 2 of those siblings sense each other. Naruto's eyelids grew heavy on that swing set long before he meant them to. Exhaustion, loneliness, the emotional weight of another birthday spent unwanted, it all pressed down on him until, almost without meaning to, he slumped forward, chin against his knees, and slipped into sleep right there in the cold night air. The dream that followed didn't feel like other dreams. Usually, when Naruto dreamed, he dreamed of ramen. Of someday becoming Hokage. Of villagers cheering his name instead of turning away. Simple dreams. Hopeful dreams. The kind of dreams that kept a lonely boy's heart beating through years that would have crushed someone weaker. This dream was different. This dream was made of sand. Not the packed dirt of the academy training grounds, not the riverbank near his apartment. This was true desert, endless and golden, stretching in every direction beneath a sky the color of a bruise. Naruto stood in the middle of it, barefoot, the grains warm beneath his feet despite the cool wind that swept past him. Where? He mumbled, turning in a slow circle. Where am I? There was no answer. Only wind. Only sand shifting endlessly against itself, whispering like something trying to speak just beyond the edge of hearing. And then, in the distance, a shape. Small. Still. A figure sitting alone atop a dune, knees drawn to chest, red hair catching what little light filtered through the strange bruised sky. Naruto's feet moved before his mind caught up, drawn forward by something he couldn't name, not curiosity exactly, not fear exactly, but a pull, deep and unfamiliar, like gravity bending sideways. Hey! He called out, though his voice sounded strange here, muffled, distant, as if the desert itself absorbed sound before it could travel too far. Hey, are you okay? The figure on the dune didn't move. Didn't even seem to hear him. Naruto climbed. The sand shifted beneath his feet, sliding, resisting, the way sand always does, and yet somehow, impossibly, he never lost his footing. He reached the top of the dune, breathing harder than the short climb should have warranted, and stopped a few feet away from the boy sitting there. Red hair, pale skin, dark rings circling tired eyes, deep enough to look almost painted on. A small stuffed bear clutched loosely in one arm. The boy looked up at him, slow, wary, like an animal assessing whether the thing in front of it was predator or prey. "Who are you?" the red-haired boy asked. His voice was quiet, flat, like it had forgotten how to expect kindness. Naruto blinked, suddenly unsure. "I don't know. Naruto. My name's Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto." "Who are you? Where is this place?" The boy stared at him for a long moment. Somewhere far beneath them, beneath the sand, beneath the dream itself, something enormous shifted, like a great sleeping creature turning over in its slumber. "I don't know," the boy finally admitted. "I've never been here before either." "Well, that makes two of us," Naruto said, and despite the strangeness of it all, despite the aching loneliness that had followed him into this dream from the real world, something about the boy's tired, wary eyes made Naruto's chest loosen just slightly. "You got a name?" A pause. "A long one. Gaara," the boy finally said. Beneath the dreamscape, beneath the layer of shared consciousness, the two boys didn't understand they were standing inside. Something far older and far more dangerous was happening. Deep within Naruto's mind, in the flooded, cavernous prison where a nine-tailed fox lay curled behind iron bars sealed with a paper talisman, two enormous crimson eyes cracked open in the darkness. "That chakra," a voice rumbled, low and ancient, vibrating through water that hadn't moved in years. "That signature. I know that signature." Kurama rose, massive, terrible, fur the color of dried blood, nine tails swaying slowly through the flooded chamber behind him, and pressed his enormous snout close to the bars separating him from the rest of the seal. "Impossible," the great fox muttered. "After all these years, the boy has found a bridge. Far away, in a different prison, in a different mind, something equally ancient stirred awake. Inside Gaara, behind a barrier of sand and seal script older than the boy who housed it, a hulking, half-formed creature, sand-skinned, single-tailed, eyes ringed with the same dark exhaustion that marked its host, opened one heavy-lidded eye. "Well, well," Shikaku rasped, voice grating like stone dragged across stone. "Now this is interesting. Little brother? Is that you I feel, all the way out here?" "Shikaku," Kurama's voice rumbled back, and somehow, impossibly, across hundreds of miles, across two separate seals, across two separate boys who had never met, the two ancient beasts felt each other for the first time in years. "It's been a long time," Shikaku said, something almost delighted creeping into its grinding voice. "Didn't think I'd ever feel one of you again. Not after what that old bastard did to us, splitting us up like firewood." "Don't get sentimental," Kurama growled. "This isn't a reunion. Our hosts are children. Fragile. Foolish. This connection is dangerous, for them, and for us." "Dangerous?" Shikaku's laugh rattled through the sand-choked chamber of its prison, half mad, half amused. "Everything about us is dangerous, Fox. That's the whole point." Kurama said nothing to that. But deep in the flooded chamber of its cage, its enormous eyes narrowed, watching, through Naruto's senses, through the thin thread of dream connection now stretching between two boys who had no idea what forces were stirring beneath their feet. "Gaara," Naruto repeated, testing the name like it was something fragile. "That's a cool name. Sounds tough." Gaara blinked, clearly not expecting that reaction. Most people who learned his name reacted with something closer to fear, or careful distance, or the particular kind of forced politeness adults used when they wanted to seem kind without actually being close. "You're not scared," Gaara said. It wasn't quite a question. Scared of what? Naruto tilted his head, genuinely confused. "You're just some kid sitting in the sand." "Why would I be scared of that?" Something in Gaara's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something adjacent to both. Something that hadn't visited his face in longer than he could remember. "Everyone's scared of me," Gaara said quietly, looking back out over the endless dunes. "Even the people who are supposed to." He trailed off, unable, or unwilling, to finish the sentence. Naruto sat down next to him without being invited, the way only a lonely 8-year-old could, with the blunt, unthinking honesty of someone who had never learned to be careful about closeness, because closeness had never been offered to him in the first place. Yeah, Naruto said after a moment, staring out at the same horizon. I get that. Gaara looked over at him, surprised. Everyone in my village is scared of me too, Naruto continued, kicking absently at the sand. I don't really get why. Nobody tells me. They just look at me like I did something wrong, like I'm gonna hurt somebody. He shrugged, though the gesture didn't quite manage to look as casual as he wanted it to. Today's my birthday. Nobody remembered. Nobody ever does. The wind shifted across the dunes, carrying grains of sand in slow spiraling patterns around them. It's my birthday too, Gaara said quietly. Naruto turned to look at him, eyes wide. No way. Seriously? Seriously, Gaara said. And for the first time since Naruto had arrived in this strange dream desert, something like the ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of the red-haired boy's mouth, small, uncertain, like a muscle remembering how to move after a long time unused. That's so weird, Naruto said, grinning now, some of the loneliness in his chest easing just slightly for reasons he couldn't explain. Maybe that's why we're here. You know. Together. Maybe it's like a birthday thing. I don't understand what here even is, Gaara admitted, glancing around at the endless dunes, the strange bruised sky, the wind that whispered without quite forming words. I've never dreamed like this before. Me either, Naruto said. Usually I just dream about ramen. That earned an actual reaction, not quite a laugh, but a small huff of air through Gaara's nose that might have been the start of one, if laughter were a thing Gaara still knew how to fully produce. For a while, the two boys simply sat there, side by side atop the dune, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. There was something oddly peaceful about it. Two children who had spent their entire short lives being watched, feared, and avoided, finally sitting beside someone who did none of those things. Someone who, for reasons neither of them understood, felt instantly, inexplicably familiar. I should probably wake up soon, Naruto said eventually, glancing up at the strange sky, where the bruised colors seemed to be shifting, fading, like a painting left out in the rain. I don't really know how this works, but I don't want to yet. Me neither, Gaara admitted. Hey, Naruto said suddenly, turning to face him fully. If I dream about you again, will you remember? This time, I mean. Will you remember me? Gaara considered the question with the same careful seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know how any of this works. But, he paused, looking down at the stuffed bear still clutched loosely in his arm, the only piece of the waking world that had somehow followed him here. I want to. Remember, I mean. Then let's make a promise, Naruto said, sticking out his hand with the blunt confidence of a boy who had watched other kids seal friendships this way and desperately wanted, just once, to do the same. If we meet again, in dreams or wherever, we remember each other. Deal? Gaara stared at the offered hand for a long moment. It had been a long time, longer than he could clearly recall, since anyone had offered him something without an agenda hiding underneath it. Slowly, carefully, like reaching towards something that might bite, Gaara extended his own hand and shook it. Deal, he said. The moment their hands touched, something rippled through the dreamscape, a pulse, faint but unmistakable, like a stone dropped into still water. Far beneath them, in the depths of two separate minds housing two separate ancient beasts, Kurama's enormous eyes narrowed sharply, and Shikaka let out a low, rasping chuckle that echoed through sand-choked stone. There it is, Shikaka murmured. The bridge just got a little sturdier, didn't it, Fox? Kurama didn't answer. But deep in its flooded prison, something that might have been the ghost of an old memory flickered behind its crimson eyes. A memory of a time long before either of these small human boys had been born, when 9 siblings had not yet been torn apart and scattered like ash across the world. The dream began to dissolve. Sand blew away in streaming gold ribbons. The bruised sky cracked apart like shattering glass, and Naruto felt himself falling, not down, but backward, out of the dream and into the cold reality of a swing set in an empty playground, autumn wind biting at his cheeks. Fireworks still crackling somewhere far away over rooftops he wasn't welcome beneath. Naruto's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he simply sat there on the swing, blinking up at the real sky, the real, unbruised, star-scattered sky of Konoha at night, trying to process what had just happened. A dream, he mumbled to himself, though something in his gut told him it hadn't felt like a dream. Not really. Dreams faded fast, usually gone within minutes of waking. This one clung to him, vivid and solid, every detail intact, the endless sand, the bruised sky, and most of all, the boy. Red hair. Tired eyes. A voice that had sounded like it hadn't laughed in years. Gaara, Naruto said aloud, testing the name against the cold night air, half expecting it to dissolve the way dreams usually did. It didn't dissolve. If anything, it settled into his memory with a strange permanence, like something that had always belonged there. Slowly, Naruto climbed off the swing, rubbing at his eyes, glancing around the empty playground as if he might somehow see sand dunes lingering at its edges. There was nothing, of course, just the same cracked pavement, the same rusted equipment, the same distant echo of a festival he wasn't part of. But something had changed. He could feel it, a strange, unfamiliar warmth settling somewhere in his chest, right where the loneliness usually sat like a stone. He wasn't sure what had just happened. He wasn't sure it would ever happen again. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Naruto Uzumaki walked home that night without feeling completely alone. Hundreds of miles away, in a modest house at the edge of Sunegakure's shinobi district, Gaara's eyes opened slowly in the dark of his room. The stuffed bear had fallen from his arms sometime during the dream, tumbling to the floor beside his bed. The cup of chamomile tea Yashimara had left behind sat cold and untouched on the nightstand, its surface unnervingly still. Gaara lay motionless for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling he had memorized every crack of, replaying the dream in his mind with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to trust good things until he'd examined them from every angle. A boy. Blonde hair. Bright, unafraid eyes. A voice that hadn't flinched when Gaara said his own name. Naruto, Gaara whispered into the empty room, and something about saying the name aloud made it feel more real, more anchored, like proof that the dream hadn't simply been another cruel trick his exhausted mind had played on him. Slowly, he sat up, reaching down to retrieve the fallen bear, holding it against his chest the way he always did, except tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The gesture didn't feel quite so much like clinging to the only comfort he had left. Deep within him, in the sand-choked chamber of its prison, Shikaku shifted with a low, rumbling chuckle. "Careful, kid," the beast murmured, voice softer now than its usual grinding rasp. "Careful. That kind of feeling's dangerous for someone like us." Gaara didn't answer aloud. He rarely spoke to the voice inside him, not when Yashimara might be listening at the door. Not when anyone might overhear and confirm the whispers already circulating through the village about the strange boy with the sand seal. But internally, silently, he thought back at the presence coiled deep inside his mind. Why does it feel different this time? Shikaku didn't answer. Perhaps it didn't know either. Gaara lay back down, staring up at the ceiling, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not dread the thought of closing his eyes again. The next morning, Naruto woke late, sunlight slanting through the thin curtains of his small apartment, and the first thing he did, before breakfast, before getting dressed, before anything else, was dig through a drawer for a stub of pencil and a crumpled sheet of paper. He sat cross-legged on his bed, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, and began to draw. It wasn't a good drawing. Naruto had never been particularly skilled with a pencil, and the proportions came out lopsided, the shading uneven, the perspective all wrong. But there, unmistakably on the crumpled paper, was a boy, red hair, tired eyes, a small stuffed bear clutched in one arm, standing atop a rough approximation of a sand dune beneath a sky Naruto had tried and failed to properly shade to match the strange bruised color he remembered. He stared at the finished drawing for a long moment, brow furrowed. "Who even are you?" he murmured to the paper, as if it might somehow answer back. Was that even real? He thought about showing it to Iruka-sensei. He thought about asking the old man at the ramen stand if he'd ever heard of a sand village kid named Gaara. He thought about a dozen different ways to try to explain what had happened, and discarded every single one. Because how exactly do you explain a shared dream to someone who'd immediately think you were making it up, or worse, who'd look at you with that same wary, careful expression everyone always used when they thought something was wrong with you? So instead, Naruto folded the drawing carefully and tucked it beneath his pillow, like a secret too fragile to expose to daylight. If I dream about you again, he thought, echoing the promise he'd made in the sand, I'll remember. He didn't know it yet, how could he? But that crumpled, lopsided drawing would become the first physical evidence of a bond that neither Konoha nor Sunagakure would understand for years to come. A bond forged not through missions, not through diplomatic summits, not through anything either village had planned or sanctioned, but through two lonely, feared children finding each other across hundreds of miles, guided by ancient beasts who remembered, even if their hosts didn't yet, that they had once been part of the same whole. Deep in the flooded chamber behind Naruto's seal, Kurama settled back onto its haunches, 9 tails curling slowly around its massive frame, crimson eyes narrowed in something that might have been thought, or might have been worry. This is a mistake, the great fox murmured to itself, voice echoing off water that hadn't stirred in years. A dangerous one. If the boy grows attached to that bond, if he seeks it out again, if the connection deepens. It trailed off, unable, or perhaps simply unwilling, to finish the thought, because somewhere beneath its ancient caution, beneath centuries of hatred toward the humans who had sealed it away, something else stirred. Something it hadn't felt in longer than it cared to admit. Curiosity. Let's see where this goes, Kurama finally muttered, more to itself than to anyone listening. For now, 3 days passed before it happened again. 3 days of Naruto sitting through academy lessons he barely absorbed, staring out the window during Iruka-sensei's lecture on basic chakra theory, half listening, mind drifting back again and again to a boy made of sand and silence. 3 days of pulling that crumpled, lopsided drawing out from under his pillow each night before bed, studying it like it might reveal some secret if he looked hard enough, then tucking it carefully away again like a treasure too fragile to leave exposed. 3 days of wondering if it had all just been some strange, elaborate dream his lonely mind had cooked up to fill the hole where friends were supposed to be. And then, on the 3rd night, exhausted from a day that had ended, as so many of his days did, with him eating a solitary bowl of instant ramen in his empty apartment, Naruto fell asleep at his kitchen table, forehead resting against his folded arms. The desert returned before he even realized he'd left the waking world. Sand. Endless, golden, warm beneath bare feet. A sky the color of a fading bruise stretched overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a familiar figure sat atop a dune, red hair catching the strange filtered light. Naruto's breath caught. "You're here," he said, and something in his voice cracked with relief he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. Gaara looked up, and for a moment, something flickered across his tired face, surprise, maybe, or the particular kind of disbelief that comes from wanting something so badly you'd convince yourself it couldn't possibly happen twice. "You remembered," Gaara said quietly. It wasn't quite a question, but it carried the shape of one, an uncertainty that had clearly been sitting heavy on him for 3 days, just as Naruto's own doubts had sat heavy on him. "Course I remembered," Naruto said, jogging up the dune to drop down beside him, sand shifting warm and strange beneath him. "You think I forget stuff like that? I even drew a picture of you. It's terrible, by the way. I'm really bad at drawing." That earned the ghost of a smile, small, uncertain, but real. "I didn't think it would happen again," Gaara admitted. "I thought maybe I made it up. That maybe I was." He trailed off, and something dark passed behind his pale eyes before he pushed it away, unwilling to finish the thought. "Made it up how?" Naruto asked, tilting his head. Gaara didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked back out over the endless dunes, arms wrapped loosely around his knees. "People say things about me sometimes. When they think I can't hear. That there's something wrong with my head. That the things I see aren't real." Naruto frowned, something protective and immediate flaring in his chest, a feeling he didn't fully understand yet, but one that would only grow stronger with every dream that followed. "Well, I saw you too," he said firmly. "So either we're both seeing the same fake thing, or it's real. And I don't think two people can imagine the exact same fake thing, right? That doesn't make sense." Gaara considered this with the same careful seriousness he seemed to bring to everything, turning the logic over like he was checking it for flaws. "No," he finally said. "I suppose it doesn't. So it's real," Naruto said, satisfied, as if that settled the matter entirely. "We're really talking. Right now." Somehow. Somehow, Gaara echoed. For a while, neither of them said anything else, content simply to sit together atop the dune, the strange bruised sky shifting slowly overhead, the wind carrying grains of sand in lazy spirals around them. It was, Naruto realized, the first time in longer than he could remember that silence hadn't felt lonely. It had simply felt peaceful. So how does this work, you think? Naruto finally asked, breaking the quiet. Like, why us? Why do we keep ending up in the same dream? Gaara was quiet for a long moment, brow furrowed in thought. I don't know, he admitted. But sometimes I feel something. Inside me. Like there's someone else there. Someone who isn't me. Naruto's breath caught. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, me too. Like there's this voice sometimes. Growling. I never really understood it. Everyone just tells me it's nothing. Mine doesn't growl, Gaara said. Mine talks. Sometimes it says things I don't want to hear. The two boys looked at each other, and something unspoken passed between them, the dawning realization that whatever strange presence lived inside each of them might be connected to this dream bridge that kept pulling them together. Neither of them knew yet how right they were. Deep beneath the surface of Naruto's mind, in the flooded, cavernous prison behind iron bars and paper seals, Kurama's enormous crimson eyes had been watching this exchange with the intense, unblinking focus of a creature that had lived through centuries of betrayal and had learned, the hard way, never to look away from anything that might turn dangerous. They're doing it again, the great fox muttered to itself, tails swaying slowly through water that hadn't rippled in years. 3 nights, and already the boy runs straight back toward it, no hesitation, no caution. Foolish. Reckless. Exactly like his father. The mention of that comparison, even internal, even unspoken to anyone but itself, carried a weight Kurama didn't fully want to examine. It shoved the thought aside, focusing instead on the more immediate, more practical concern coiling in its ancient gut. Because far away, in a different prison, in a different mind, another presence was stirring, one Kurama hadn't felt directly in longer than it cared to calculate, and one it had never, in all its centuries of existence, learned to fully trust. You're still awake, I see, a grating voice rasped through the growing thread of connection now stretching taut between the two dreaming boys, a voice like stone grinding against stone, half mad, wholly unpredictable. Or should I say, you're still watching. Same old paranoid fox. Shikaku, Kurama growled, not bothering to hide the distaste coating the name. I'd hoped the first encounter was a fluke. A temporary weakness in the seals. Apparently not. Apparently not, Shikaku agreed, and something like delight crept into its rough voice, the kind of delight that came from watching something chaotic unfold, and refusing to stop it. Our little hosts seemed quite taken with each other. Isn't that sweet? It's dangerous, Kurama snapped. You understand that, don't you? If this bond deepens, if the boy grows attached, if he starts relying on a connection that exists outside the seal's natural boundaries, there's no telling what it might do to the stability of the containment. To him. To your host as well, for that matter, though I doubt you care much about that. There was a pause, a long one, filled with the distant whisper of shifting sand echoing through Shikaku's cavernous prison. You'd be surprised, the beast finally said, and something in its voice had shifted, grown quieter, less mocking. My host doesn't sleep, Fox. Not properly. Not since the seal was placed on him. Every night is a battle for him, whether he wins it or loses it. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? What it's already starting to do? Kurama said nothing, though its enormous eyes narrowed slightly, some old, buried part of it, a part it rarely acknowledged, let alone examined, recognizing the weight behind Shikaku's words. This is the first night in longer than I can remember that he's actually slept without fighting me for control, Shikaku continued, quieter still. Whatever this bridge is, whatever's causing it, it's calming him. Stabilizing him. If you want to sever it out of some misguided caution, Fox, you go right ahead. But you'll be doing it against my will, and against my host's only real comfort. Kurama was silent for a long moment, weighing this new information against centuries of hard-earned distrust. I make no promises, it finally said. But I will observe. For now. That's all I'm asking, Shikaku rasped, something almost like satisfaction threading through its grinding voice. For now, above, unaware of the negotiation happening in the depths of their own minds, Naruto and Gaara continued talking, carefully, slowly, the way two children who had never really been allowed to make friends might talk when finally given the chance. So what's it like? Naruto asked. Living in the sand village, I mean. Is it always this hot? Hotter, Gaara said. During the day, the sand gets hot enough to burn bare feet if you stand still too long. At night it gets cold. Very cold. People don't usually understand that about the desert, that it's not just heat. It's extremes, Naruto said, genuinely fascinated despite himself. That's kinda cool, actually. Not the burning feet part. The extremes part. What about the Leaf Village? Gaara asked, something careful and curious in his tone. The tone of someone unused to asking questions about another person's life because he'd rarely been given the chance to care about anyone else's life before. It's green, Naruto said, like that summed everything up. Trees everywhere. Rains a lot. There's this old man who runs a ramen stand near my apartment. Tucci. Best ramen in the whole world, probably the whole world. I go there almost every day. What's ramen? Gaara asked. Naruto's jaw actually dropped. You've never had ramen? I don't think so, Gaara said, faintly alarmed by the intensity of Naruto's reaction. That's it. Okay, someday, somehow, I'm gonna make sure you try ramen. I don't know how yet, but I'm gonna do it. That's like a crime. Growing up without ramen, Gaara blinked, clearly unused to anyone being this passionately invested in anything related to him, let alone something as small as a bowl of noodles. And yet, there was something warm curling in his chest at the declaration, something he didn't have a name for yet, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Okay, he said quietly. Okay? Naruto repeated, grinning. Okay, Gaara confirmed, and for the first time, something that might genuinely have been called a smile, small, hesitant, but unmistakably real, crossed his face. They talked for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely in the dream space, stretching and folding in ways neither boy fully understood. Naruto told Gaara about the academy, about Iruka-sensei, about his ambition to become Hokage someday, and make the whole village finally look at him with something other than fear or disdain. Gaara listened with quiet intensity, occasionally asking careful, precise questions, clearly unused to hearing anyone speak so openly about their hopes. In turn, Gaara spoke, haltingly at first, then with growing ease, about his siblings. An older brother named Kankuro, who painted his face with purple markings and carried a large wrapped bundle everywhere he went, though Gaara wasn't entirely sure what was inside it yet. An older sister named Temari, sharp-tongued and fiercely independent, who carried a massive fan on her back that seemed far too heavy for someone her age to wield so easily. Do they like you? Naruto asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of the question the moment it left his mouth. Sorry, I didn't mean. It's fine, Gaara said, though something in his posture had gone slightly rigid. I don't know. They're careful around me. Everyone's careful around me. A pause. Except my uncle, I suppose. Yashimaru. He's kind to me. Mostly. Something in the way Gaara said mostly, a small hesitation, barely perceptible, snagged at Naruto's attention, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He filed it away without fully understanding its significance, the way children often do with details that will only matter much, much later. What about you? Gaara asked, turning the question back. Do you have family? Naruto shook his head. Nah. Never had any. I live by myself. Have since I can remember. He said it lightly, the way he'd learned to say most difficult things, with a shrug and a grin, armor built from years of practice at not letting anyone see how much it actually hurt. Gaara studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. That's sad, he finally said, with the blunt honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned to soften difficult truths. Yeah, well, Naruto said, looking away, it's whatever. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be used to it, Gaara said quietly. Naruto blinked, caught off guard by the simple sincerity of the statement. Nobody had ever said anything like that to him before, not with that particular kind of quiet certainty. The kind that came from someone who understood loneliness intimately enough to recognize it instantly in someone else. Yeah, Naruto said eventually, voice softer than before. You too, you know. You shouldn't have to be used to whatever it is you're used to either. Something passed between them in that moment. An unspoken understanding. Two lonely children recognizing, for the first time in either of their short lives, a kindred loneliness in someone else. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy performed for show. It was simply recognition, the quiet, powerful recognition of I see you, and I understand, because I have lived something similar. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of moment we live for, the quiet ones, the small ones, the ones that don't involve flashy jutsu or dramatic battles, but instead just two kids finding something they never thought they'd have. Because everything that happens later, every fight, every crisis, every moment where this bond gets tested to its breaking point, all of it starts right here, in a shared dream made of sand and silence. So if you're feeling this one, drop a like, leave a comment telling us what you think happens next, and let's keep going, because things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. I have a question, Naruto said eventually, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them. What is it? Are you scared of me too? The question hung in the strange bruised air between them, heavier than Naruto had intended it to be. He hadn't quite planned to ask it, it had simply slipped out, born from 3 days of turning over the strange similarities between himself and this boy he'd only just met, wondering if the wariness he'd sensed in Gaara from the very first moment was the same wariness he'd learned to recognize in every adult who'd ever looked at him. Gaara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless dunes stretching toward the horizon. I don't know how to answer that, he finally said. I've never met anyone who wasn't scared of me before. Not really. Not fully. That's not an answer, Naruto pointed out, gently. Gaara turned to look at him then, pale eyes searching Naruto's face with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable in its rawness. You're the first person who's talked to me like I'm just a person, he said slowly, carefully choosing each word like it cost him something to say it aloud. Not like I'm something dangerous. Not like I'm something to be managed, or watched, or handled carefully. Just a person. Like you? He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his tired face. So no, Gaara said finally. I'm not scared of you. I don't think I could be, even if I wanted to. You're the only thing that's ever felt safe. Naruto felt something tighten in his chest, not painful, exactly, but heavy, significant, the weight of being trusted with something fragile and precious. He'd never had anyone say anything like that to him before, and he found himself struggling to find words worthy of the moment. Yeah, he finally managed. Yeah, me too. You're the first person who's ever just talked to me. Like I'm not gonna do something bad just by existing. The wind shifted around them, sand whispering across the dunes in slow spirals, and for a moment, neither boy said anything else. They simply sat there, side by side, two children who had spent their entire short lives being feared, watched, and avoided, finally allowing themselves the fragile, dangerous luxury of feeling understood. It was Gaara who eventually broke the silence, his voice quieter, more hesitant than before, like he was venturing into territory he wasn't sure was safe to explore. Naruto, he said slowly. Do you ever hear a voice? Inside you, I mean. Not like your own thoughts. Something else. Naruto's brow furrowed, and after a moment he nodded slowly. Yeah. Sometimes. It's like growling, mostly. I never really understood what it was. Nobody ever explains anything to me, they just get weird and quiet whenever I bring it up, so I stopped asking. Mind talks, Gaara said. Not growling. Actual words. It says my sleep is dangerous. That if I let my guard down too much, it might. He stopped abruptly, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like fear, quickly buried and pushed away. Might what? Naruto pressed gently. It doesn't matter, Gaara said, a little too quickly, a little too firmly, the shutters coming down over whatever vulnerability had briefly cracked open. I probably shouldn't have brought it up. Naruto studied him for a moment, sensing the sudden retreat but choosing, with an instinct that would serve him well throughout the years to come, not to push. Okay, he said simply. You don't gotta tell me if you don't want to. But if you ever do want to talk about it, I'm here. I mean, I guess I'm here whenever we're both asleep at the same time, which is a weird way for a friendship to work, but still. I'm here. Something in Gaara's posture eased slightly at that. The quiet, unconditional offer, free of pressure, free of demand. Friendship, Gaara repeated softly, testing the word like it was something foreign and precious. Is that what this is? Naruto grinned, some of the earlier tension breaking. Course it is. What else would you call it? We shook on it last time, remember? That's like official. Can't take it back now. For the second time that night, something that might genuinely have been called a smile crossed Gaara's face. Small, uncertain, but real, and growing steadier with each passing moment. Friendship, he said again, and this time, there was something almost like acceptance in the way he said it. Far beneath them, in the depths of two separate minds, two ancient beasts continued their own quiet, wary negotiation. You hear that? Shikaka rasped, something almost amused threading through its grinding voice. Friendship. How touching. Don't mock it, Kurama growled, though there was less heat in the words than there might have been a few nights prior. Whatever this is, it's clearly doing something neither of us fully understands. Your host slept peacefully tonight. Mine, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, seems less consumed by that particular ache he carries constantly beneath the surface. So you admit it's not entirely a mistake, then, Shikaka said, something almost triumphant in its tone. I admit nothing of the sort, Kurama snapped, though the denial came a beat too slow to be fully convincing. I merely acknowledge that the situation is more complicated than I initially assessed. Sure, Fox. Whatever helps you sleep at night, Shikaka said, and the pun seemed to genuinely delight the unstable beast, judging by the low, grinding chuckle that followed. Kurama said nothing further, choosing instead to simply watch the strange, fragile bond continuing to strengthen between the two dreaming boys above, watch the way its own ancient, weary heart, buried beneath centuries of hatred and betrayal, found itself unable to fully condemn what it was witnessing. Because if it was being honest with itself, and Kurama rarely allowed itself that particular luxury, there was something almost familiar about watching two young Jinchūriki find comfort in each other. Something that stirred old, distant memories of a time before the Sage of Six Paths had torn 9 siblings apart, and scattered them across a fractured world. A time when connection between beasts like Kurama and Shikaka hadn't been dangerous. It had simply been natural. I will continue observing, Kurama finally said, quieter now, almost to itself. But if this bond begins to threaten the stability of the seal, if it begins to threaten the boy's safety in any way, I will act to sever it. Regardless of what either host wants. Fair enough, Shikaka said. Though I suspect you'll find that harder to do than you think, Fox. Once something like this takes root, it doesn't uproot easily. Kurama didn't respond to that. Deep down, in some ancient, buried part of itself it rarely acknowledged, it suspected Shikaka was right. Above, in the dream that neither boy fully understood the mechanics of, the strange bruised sky had begun to shift and pale, streaks of something like dawn creeping across its edges. I think it's ending, Gaara said, noticing the change first, something like reluctance coloring his voice. Naruto looked up, watching the sky shift. Yeah, he said, a little disappointed. It always does that right before we wake up, I think. Will it happen again? Gaara asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question, something that betrayed just how much this fragile connection had already come to mean to him in the span of 2 short dream meetings. I don't know, Naruto admitted honestly. But I hope so. I really hope so. Me too, Gaara said quietly. The sky continued to pale, the dunes beginning to blur at their edges like watercolors bleeding into rain. Before the dream could fully dissolve, Naruto turned to Gaara one last time. Hey, he said. Even if it doesn't happen again for a while, even if it takes forever, I'm not gonna forget you. I promise. For real this time, not just a shake hands promise. A real one. Gaara looked at him, something fierce and fragile flickering behind his tired eyes. I won't forget either, he said. I don't think I could, even if I tried. The dream dissolved around them, sand scattering into golden light, the bruised sky cracking open into something brighter, and Naruto felt himself falling backward, out of the dream and into the cold reality of his kitchen table, forehead still resting against his folded arms, a thin line of drool cooling against his sleeve. Naruto's eyes blinked open slowly, and for a long moment, he simply sat there at his small kitchen table, processing what had just happened, replaying every detail of the conversation with a kind of careful, deliberate focus, determined not to let a single word slip away into forgetfulness. Friendship, he murmured to himself, testing the word the same way Gaara had, and found himself smiling, a real smile, wide and warm, the kind that hadn't visited his face in longer than he cared to admit. He glanced toward the window, where early morning light was just beginning to filter through the thin curtains, painting the small apartment in pale gold. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Naruto Uzumaki didn't feel quite so alone anymore. Hundreds of miles away, in a modest house at the edge of Sunegakure's shinobi district, Gaara's eyes opened slowly, and for a long moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the familiar cracked ceiling, replaying the conversation with the same careful, deliberate focus. Friendship. He turned the word over in his mind, testing its weight, testing whether it might dissolve if he examined it too closely. The way so many good things in his short life had dissolved the moment he tried to hold on to them too tightly. It didn't dissolve. If anything, it settled into his chest with a strange, unfamiliar warmth, like proof that something good could exist even for someone like him. The bedroom door creaked open, and Yashimaru stepped inside, carrying a small tray with a warm cup of tea, his gentle expression carefully arranged in its usual practiced kindness. "You slept well last night," Yashimaru observed, setting the tray down on the nightstand. "You seem different this morning. Lighter somehow." Gaara considered how to answer that, weighing the careful instinct that told him not to share too much, not to let anyone, even Yashimaru, glimpse the fragile, precious thing that had begun growing inside him. "I had a good dream," Gaara finally said, which was true, even if it left out almost everything that actually mattered. Yashimaru's expression softened slightly, something almost like genuine warmth flickering behind his careful eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You deserve good dreams, Gaara. More than you know." He left the room a moment later, the door clicking shut behind him, and Gaara sat alone in the quiet morning light, holding the small stuffed bear against his chest, thinking about a blonde-haired boy hundreds of miles away who had looked at him without an ounce of fear in his eyes. "I'm not scared of you," Naruto had said. "You're the only thing that's ever felt safe." Gaara closed his eyes, allowing himself, just for a moment, the dangerous luxury of hope. That morning, 3 villages away in Konoha's ninja academy, Naruto sat through Iruka-sensei's lecture on basic shuriken technique with an uncharacteristic focus, occasionally glancing down at a crumpled drawing tucked carefully into his notebook. A second sketch now, slightly better than the first, showing 2 small figures sitting together atop a sand dune. He didn't notice Iruka watching him with quiet curiosity from the front of the classroom, puzzled by the unusual attentiveness, the small, private smile that kept tugging at the corner of Naruto's mouth throughout the lesson. He didn't notice, either, the careful way Iruka would later mention to Hiruzen, almost in passing, almost as an afterthought, that Naruto had seemed different that day. Lighter somehow, like something had shifted, though the old Chunin instructor couldn't have said exactly what. Small observations. Small changes. The kind of details that seem insignificant in the moment, but that will, years later, form the first fragile threads of a pattern someone far more suspicious than Iruka will eventually start to notice. But that's a story for later chapters. For now, 2 lonely boys, hundreds of miles apart, connected by a bond neither of them fully understood, guarded and watched by 2 ancient beasts still negotiating their own uneasy truce, carried the quiet warmth of friendship through their days, waiting, hoping, for the next dream that would bring them back together. Neither of them knew yet how dangerous that hope would prove to be. Neither of them knew that somewhere in Sunegakure, storm clouds were already beginning to gather around Gaara's home, clouds that would test this fragile new bond far sooner, and far more brutally, than either boy could possibly anticipate. Neither of them knew that the dream bridge connecting them was only the first step in a much longer, much more dangerous journey, one that would eventually pull them out of dreams and into the waking world, where the stakes would be higher, the risks greater, and the price of discovery far more severe than either of them could imagine. But that's a story for the chapters ahead. It started, as most unlikely things do, with paperwork. 3 weeks after that first birthday dream, A modest trade agreement between Konoha and Sunigake reached its scheduled renewal date. A routine exchange of goods that happened twice a year along a stretch of neutral border territory between the two nations. Dried fruit from the land of wind traded for preserved grains, and tea leaves from the land of fire. Bolts of desert-treated cloth exchanged for medicinal herbs that grew only in Konoha's forests. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made headlines. Just the quiet, unglamorous machinery of two allied villages maintaining a peace that had held, more or less, since the last Great War. Hiruzen Sarutobi, in his role as Hokage, had signed off on the routine caravan escort weeks earlier without a second thought. A handful of Chunin would accompany the merchants to the border checkpoint, exchange goods with their Suna counterparts, and return within 3 days. Standard procedure. Nothing worth the Hokage's personal attention. What he hadn't anticipated, what nobody in either village had anticipated, was that the academy would schedule a field trip to observe the caravan's departure that same week, part of a broader curriculum unit on inter-village diplomacy and trade relations. And he certainly hadn't anticipated that one particular blonde-haired academy student would spend the entire week leading up to that field trip in a state of barely contained excitement that had nothing to do with diplomacy or trade at all. A caravan, Naruto had whispered to himself the moment Iruka-sensei announced the field trip, eyes going wide with an idea forming so fast it practically crackled. A caravan going toward the sand border. He hadn't said anything about it in class, of course. He'd learned, over years of being the only kid nobody wanted to sit near, that keeping his mouth shut about things that mattered to him was usually the safer choice. But that night, curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting for sleep to carry him back into the desert, his mind raced through possibilities. If the caravan's heading toward the border, and Gaara's from the sand, maybe. He didn't let himself finish the thought until he was actually standing in the dream that night, sand warm beneath his feet, Gaara already waiting atop their familiar dune. Guess what? Naruto blurted out before he'd even fully settled beside his friend. Gaara blinked, mildly startled by the sudden energy. What? There's a caravan, Naruto said, practically vibrating with excitement. From my village. Going toward the border. My whole class is gonna go watch it leave, some boring lesson about trade or whatever, but what if? He trailed off, letting the idea hang there, half-formed and reckless. Understanding dawned slowly across Gaara's face. You want to actually meet, he said quietly. In the real world, don't you? Naruto asked, suddenly uncertain, worried he'd overstepped some boundary he didn't understand yet. Gaara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless dunes, something complicated working behind his tired eyes. I do, he admitted finally. More than almost anything. But it's complicated. My guards. My uncle. Nobody lets me go anywhere alone. Not really. My guards are basically Iruka-sensei not counting heads carefully enough, Naruto said with a grin, though something more serious sat beneath the joke. I can probably sneak off for a bit. But you, he paused, worry creeping into his voice. Is it gonna be dangerous? For you, I mean. If you get caught? Gaara considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things, weighing risk against reward with a caution that belied his young age. I've been practicing something, he said slowly, a way of moving with the sand. Fast. It's not perfect yet, but I think I could get away for a short time. If I'm careful. You sure? Naruto asked, and the genuine concern in his voice, the fact that he was asking about Gaara's safety before even fully celebrating the possibility of meeting, settled something warm and unfamiliar in Gaara's chest. I'm sure, Gaara said, and for the first time, something like real excitement flickered across his usually guarded expression. When does your caravan leave? 5 days, Naruto said. There's this rocky area near the border. I heard Iruka-sensei mention it during the lesson planning. Some kind of overlook where you can see both villages' territory. If your border patrols pass near there too. They do, Gaara said, already calculating. Occasionally. It's not heavily guarded. Mostly just routine sweeps. So maybe, Naruto said, hardly daring to hope. Maybe we could actually meet, Gaara finished, and the word hung between them, fragile and enormous all at once. Deep beneath the surface of their shared minds, Two ancient beasts listened to this planning with very different reactions. Absolutely not, Kurama growled the moment the dream ended and Naruto's consciousness settled into deeper, dreamless sleep, leaving the great fox alone with its thoughts in the flooded chamber of its prison. This is precisely the kind of reckless foolishness I warned against. A physical meeting? Outside the safety of the dream space, where discovery carries no real consequence. The boy is inviting disaster. Across the vast distance separating the two seals, Shikaku's grinding chuckle rippled through the connection that had, over the past weeks, grown steadily stronger and more stable between the two beasts. Disaster, or the first genuine risk either of these children has ever taken for something they actually want, Shikaku said. You've grown soft in your cage, Fox. All that caution, all that careful, measured distance. When's the last time you actually wanted something badly enough to risk anything for it? I am not the one who should be taking risks, Kurama snapped. I am contained. Sealed. My choices are not my own to make freely, and neither, might I remind you, are theirs. If either boy is caught, if either village discovers what's happening, the consequences could be severe. Suspicion. Isolation. Perhaps worse. Perhaps, Shikaku agreed, more serious now than its usual mocking tone allowed. But consider the alternative, Fox. My host is fraying. Every day that passes without something, anything, to anchor him, he drifts further from whatever thin thread of stability he still clings to. This bond, dangerous as it is, has done more to steady him in a few short weeks than anything else has managed in years. If you take that away from him now, I'm not suggesting we take it away, Kurama interrupted, something almost weary creeping into its ancient voice. I'm suggesting caution. There's a difference between nurturing a bond and allowing two children to blunder recklessly toward exposure. Then help them, Shikaku said simply. Silence stretched through the connection, heavy and considering. What do you mean? Kurama finally asked, suspicion coloring every syllable. I mean exactly what I said, Shikaku replied. If you're so concerned about caution, about minimizing risk, then use what you know. Guide the boy. Help him plan more carefully than his reckless little heart would manage alone. You clearly care what happens to him, Fox, whatever pride keeps you from admitting it outright. So don't just watch from behind your bars complaining about the danger. Do something useful with all that ancient wisdom you're so fond of reminding me you possess. Kurama said nothing for a long moment, crimson eyes narrowed in the dark, turning the suggestion over with obvious reluctance. I make no promises, it finally muttered. But I will consider it. Over the following 4 nights, something shifted in the dream meetings between Naruto and Gaara, a growing sense of purpose, of careful planning. As the two boys mapped out every detail of their reckless plan with the earnest, meticulous focus only children plotting something forbidden can truly muster, they settled on the rocky overlook Naruto had mentioned, a natural formation of weathered stone rising above the flat expanse of borderland scrubland, positioned just close enough to both patrol routes to be reachable, just far enough from the main caravan road to avoid casual notice. Gaara, drawing on knowledge of Suna's patrol schedules gleaned from years of quiet, careful observation, calculated a window of roughly 40 minutes when the area would likely be clear of sand shinobi. Naruto, for his part, spent an unusual amount of focus during academy lessons that week, not on the material itself, but on memorizing the caravan's planned route and the schedule Iruka-sensei had outlined for the field trip observation. He noted, with the kind of sharp, practical attention he rarely displayed for anything academic, exactly when the class would be gathered watching the caravan's formal departure ceremony, and exactly how long that ceremony traditionally lasted. 20 minutes for the ceremony, he reported to Gaara on the 4th night, ticking details off on his fingers with unusual seriousness. Iruka-sensei always does a head count before we start walking back, but not during the ceremony itself. Everyone's just standing around watching the merchants and the escort team line up. If I slip toward the back of the group and just keep walking, you'd need to be fast, Gaara said, brow furrowed in concentration. The overlook is roughly a 15-minute run from the ceremony grounds, based on what you've described. That leaves very little margin. I'm fast, Naruto said, grinning with more confidence than the plan probably deserved. Trust me. Gaara studied him for a moment, something warm and worried tangled together behind his pale eyes. I do trust you, he said quietly. That's what scares me a little. Naruto's grin softened into something gentler. Hey, he said. We got this. 5 days, right? Then we actually get to meet. For real. Not just dream real. For real, Gaara echoed, and despite every careful, anxious calculation running through his mind, something in his chest lifted at the thought. The morning of the caravan's departure arrived with the kind of bright, deceptively ordinary sunshine that makes momentous days feel, in the moment, disarmingly mundane. Naruto woke before his alarm, too nervous and excited to manage more than a few scattered hours of actual sleep, and spent nearly 20 minutes staring at himself in his apartment's small, cracked mirror, trying to decide if there was anything he should do differently for this, whatever this was. Meeting a friend for the first time in real life felt like it should require some kind of preparation, though he couldn't have said exactly what. In the end, he settled for simply pulling on his usual orange and blue jacket, grabbing 2 neatly wrapped onigiri he'd carefully prepared himself the night before, a clumsy, slightly lopsided attempt that had taken 3 tries to get the rice to hold its shape properly, and tucking them into his bag alongside his academy supplies. Just in case, he told himself, though he knew, deep down, that this small gesture mattered more than he was letting himself fully admit. Nobody had ever made him food with care. He wanted, more than almost anything, to be the person who did that for someone else, for Gaara, for the first time. Hundreds of miles away, in Sunagakure, Gaara was going through his own quiet preparations, though his came with a heavier weight of calculation and risk. He'd spent the previous night carefully studying the sand shunshin technique he'd been developing in secret, a crude, unstable adaptation born from watching how Shikaku's chakra interacted with sand during moments of stress, refined through weeks of careful, solitary practice in the small courtyard behind his house, always waiting until he was certain no one was watching. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to reliable. But it was, he'd calculated, his best chance at slipping away from his assigned guard rotation for the narrow window he'd need. You understand the risk you're taking, Shikaku said quietly as Gaara dressed that morning, checking and rechecking the small pouch of sand he always kept tied at his hip. If that technique fails at the wrong moment. I know, Gaara thought back, steady despite the anxiety coiling in his stomach. I've calculated the risk. I'm doing this anyway. Something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply resignation, rippled through the connection from Shikaku's end. Very well, I'll do what I can to steady the chakra flow if the technique starts to falter. Consider it a professional courtesy. Thanks, Gaara thought, and meant it. The academy field trip proceeded exactly as Iruka-sensei had outlined. 28 students marched in a loose, chattering formation toward the designated overlook point near the border checkpoint, where the caravan's formal departure ceremony was already being prepared. Merchants checked their wares one final time. Escort Chunin ran through last-minute equipment checks. A small crowd of village onlookers had gathered as well, drawn by the modest spectacle of a trade caravan setting off towards sand territory. All right, everyone, gather round, Iruka-sensei called out, herding his students into a rough semicircle near a low stone wall that offered a reasonable vantage point of the ceremony grounds. Remember what we discussed in class. Pay attention to the formal exchange protocols. This is exactly the kind of diplomatic procedure you might find yourselves escorting someday as Chunin. Naruto, positioned near the back of the group as planned, nodded along with feigned attentiveness, heart hammering against his ribs with a mixture of excitement and nerves he hoped didn't show too obviously on his face. He glanced sideways at Sakura, chattering animatedly with a cluster of other girls a few feet away, and then towards Sasuke, standing slightly apart from the group with his usual air of detached indifference, and felt a brief pang of something complicated, not quite jealousy, not quite loneliness, but some cousin of both, at how easily everyone else seemed to belong here, in this ordinary moment, while he counted down minutes until he could slip away towards something far stranger and far more precious. The ceremony began. A senior Konoha official exchanged formal greetings with the caravan's lead merchant. Escort Chunin took their positions. Iruka-sensei, predictably, became absorbed in narrating the diplomatic significance of each small ritual gesture to his attentive, and not so attentive, students. Naruto watched the minutes tick by with agonizing slowness, waiting for the precise moment he'd calculated as his best chance. It came roughly 12 minutes into the ceremony, when the formal exchange of trade documents drew the entire group's attention forward, students craning to watch the ceremonial sealing of the agreement scrolls. In that brief window of collective distraction, Naruto took 2 careful steps backward, then 3 more, angling himself behind a cluster of taller students, and finally slipped around the edge of the low stone wall, and into the scrubland beyond. His heart pounded as he broke into a run, ducking low behind scattered rock formations, moving as fast and as quietly as his 8-year-old legs could manage, retracing the route he'd memorized from Irika-sensei's lesson planning with a precision that would have surprised anyone who'd only ever seen him struggle through academy exams. 15 minutes, he reminded himself, lungs burning as he pushed forward. Just 15 minutes. Meanwhile, in Sunigakure, Gaara had begun his own careful escape. His guard rotation, 2 Chunin assigned to monitor his movements from a discreet distance. A precaution the village council had insisted upon following certain incidents in his early years that we'll explore more fully in chapters ahead, had settled into their usual mid-morning routine. Positioned near the edge of the training grounds where Gaara typically spent several supervised hours each week, Gaara waited until both guards were engaged in a quiet conversation near the training grounds entrance, their attention momentarily divided, and drew on every ounce of careful preparation from the previous night. Sand gathered around his feet, responding to the careful, controlled pulse of chakra he pushed into it, Shikaku's presence steadying the flow just enough to keep the technique from destabilizing entirely. Now, Shikaku murmured internally, and Gaara pushed forward, the world blurring at its edges as sand carried him in a swift, grainy rush across the training grounds perimeter and out through a gap in the low outer wall he'd identified days earlier during careful, methodical scouting. The technique held, barely, unstably, sand scattering in his wake in a way that would have been immediately noticeable to anyone paying close attention, but it held long enough to carry him nearly half the distance toward the border overlook before the chakra finally gave out, leaving him stumbling forward onto solid ground, breathing hard, heart racing with a mixture of adrenaline and something that felt disturbingly close to joy. It worked, he thought, allowing himself a small, disbelieving laugh. It actually worked. Don't celebrate yet, Shikaku cautioned, though even the ancient beast's grinding voice carried an unmistakable note of something like pride. You're not there yet. And that technique needs time to recover before you can use it again, which means you're walking back, one way or another. Gaara nodded to himself, pushing forward on foot now, covering the remaining distance at a steady jog, the familiar shape of the rocky overlook finally coming into view against the horizon. Naruto arrived first, scrambling up the final stretch of weathered stone with lungs burning and legs aching, and dropped down onto a flat outcropping near the top, gasping for breath, scanning the horizon anxiously. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but empty scrublands stretching toward the distant shape of Sunigakure's outer walls, and a cold, creeping fear began settling into Naruto's chest. The fear that maybe something had gone wrong, that maybe Gaara's plan had failed, that maybe he'd risked everything for nothing. And then, cresting a low rise roughly 200 meters away, a small figure came into view, red hair unmistakable even at a distance, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone conserving the last of their energy. Gaara! Naruto called out, unable to contain the relief and excitement flooding through him, waving both arms overhead despite every instinct telling him to stay quiet, to stay careful. Gaara looked up, and even from this distance, Naruto could see something shift in his posture, the wariness easing, replaced by something lighter, something that looked almost like disbelief giving way to genuine joy. The final approach felt, to both boys, like it stretched on forever and passed in an instant all at once. And then, finally, impossibly, they were standing face to face, not in a dream, not in some shared unconscious space built from ancient chakra and desperate longing, but in the real, solid, sunlit world, close enough to reach out and touch. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. They simply stood there, staring at each other with the particular, disbelieving wonder of two people who had spent weeks building an entire friendship on a foundation that had, until this very moment, existed only in sleep. You're real, Gaara finally said, voice barely above a whisper, something raw and vulnerable cracking through his usual careful composure. I mean, I knew you were real. But this is different, Naruto finished, grinning wide enough that it nearly hurt. Yeah, it's different. And then, With the blunt, unthinking honesty that had characterized every moment of their friendship so far, Naruto crossed the remaining distance, and wrapped his arms around Gaara in a fierce, sudden hug. Gaara went rigid for a moment, entirely unused to physical contact that wasn't laced with caution or careful restraint, and then, slowly, hesitantly, like something in him was relearning a motion it had forgotten how to make, he lifted his own arms and returned the embrace. Well, Shikaka murmured somewhere deep in the recesses of Gaara's mind, something unmistakably soft threading through its usual rough voice. Would you look at that? Far away, deep in the flooded chamber of its own prison, Kurama said nothing at all, but something in its ancient, weary heart, buried beneath centuries of caution and distrust, allowed itself, just this once, to feel something close to peace. They pulled apart eventually, both of them a little embarrassed, both of them grinning despite the embarrassment, and settled onto the flat outcropping together, looking out over the borderland stretching between their two villages. I brought something, Naruto said, suddenly remembering, and dug into his bag to retrieve the two carefully wrapped onigiri, slightly squashed from the run but otherwise intact. I made these. Well, I tried to make these. They're probably not very good, but he held one out, and Gaara accepted it with the same careful, deliberate hesitation he brought to most unfamiliar gestures, the wariness of someone unused to being given things without an agenda attached. You made this? Gaara asked, turning the slightly lopsided rice ball over in his hands, studying it with genuine curiosity. Yeah, it's rice, mostly. And a little bit of dried fish inside, and some seasoning, Naruto explained, suddenly self-conscious. It's called onigiri. Figured since you never had ramen, you probably haven't had this either, and I couldn't exactly carry a bowl of hot ramen all the way out here without it going cold or spilling everywhere, so, Gaara took a careful bite, chewing thoughtfully, and something in his expression shifted, surprise, then something warmer, something almost startled by how much he liked it. It's good, he said, sounding genuinely surprised by the admission. Really? Naruto's face lit up. I mean, I know it's not as good as the ramen at Ichiraku's, but it's good, Gaara repeated, more firmly this time, taking another bite. Thank you? For making it. Something warm settled in Naruto's chest at the simple, sincere gratitude in Gaara's voice, the kind of gratitude that came from someone who clearly wasn't used to receiving thoughtful gestures, someone for whom even a slightly lopsided rice ball carried real, significant weight. Course, Naruto said, a little gruffly, suddenly needing to look away toward the horizon rather than at Gaara's face. That's what friends do, right? I suppose it is, Gaara said quietly, and took another careful bite. They talked for a while after that, real conversation, unhurried and easy, the kind that felt different somehow from even their most comfortable dream meetings, grounded now in the solid reality of sunlight and warm stone and the distant sound of wind moving across open scrubland. So this is what the border looks like, Naruto said, gesturing out at the landscape stretching in both directions. Kinda weird, right? Like, there's no actual line or anything. It's just land. Just becomes one place and then becomes the other place, and nobody can even tell exactly where. I've thought about that before, Gaara admitted. How strange it is that villages fight wars over lines that don't actually exist anywhere except on maps. Yeah, Naruto said, considering this with more seriousness than he usually brought to such abstract thoughts. That's kinda messed up, when you think about it. Most things are, when you think about them carefully enough, Gaara said, and there was something dryly knowing in the observation that made Naruto huff out a surprised laugh. Okay, that was almost a joke, Naruto said, grinning. Look at you, being funny. Gaara's mouth twitched, something that might have become a genuine smile if he'd let it fully form. I don't joke very often, he admitted. I'm not sure I'm very good at it. You're getting better, Naruto said encouragingly. Practice makes perfect, right? That's what Iruka-sensei always says. Not that I'm very good at listening to that advice most of the time. They fell into a comfortable rhythm of conversation after that, trading small details about their lives with the easy openness that had characterized their dream meetings from the very beginning. Naruto, describing the layout of his small apartment, the particular squeak of his third stair, the way Tucci at the ramen stand always gave him an extra portion of thin-sliced chicken, prepared the same savory way, without ever making him feel like it was charity. Gaara, in turn, described the layout of Sunegakure's shinobi district, the particular quality of desert silence at night, the careful way Temari always checked on him before bed even though she rarely said much of substance while doing it. She cares, Naruto observed. Even if she doesn't say it. I think so, Gaara said slowly, like he was turning the thought over for the first time. I've never really thought about it that way before. It was Naruto who eventually brought up the harder question, the one that had been sitting quietly at the edges of both their minds since the very beginning of this friendship. Hey, he said, picking at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve. We should probably figure out, rules for this, so we don't mess it up. Gaara looked over at him, curious. Rules? Yeah, Naruto paused, thinking it through carefully, an unusual seriousness settling over his features. Nobody can know about this, right? Not for a while, at least. If anyone found out, if my village found out, or your village found out, I don't know exactly what would happen, but I don't think it'd be good. No, Gaara agreed quietly. It wouldn't be. So, Rule 1, Naruto said, holding up a finger. We keep this secret. From everyone. No exceptions, unless we both agree it's okay first. Agreed, Gaara said. Rule 2, Naruto continued, we protect each other's secret. If something happens, if someone gets suspicious, we don't rat each other out. We figure it out together. Agreed, Gaara said again, something solemn in his voice. Rule 3, Naruto said softer now. We keep meeting. However we can. Dreams, mostly I guess, since we probably can't do this. He gestured at the space between them, at the solid reality of meeting in person, very often. But whenever we can, however we can, we keep finding a way. Gaara was quiet for a long moment, something deeply moved working behind his tired eyes. Agreed, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. And Rule 4, Naruto added, grinning now, some of the earlier seriousness breaking into something lighter. Someday, somehow, you're gonna try real ramen. That's non-negotiable. Gaara actually laughed at that, a real laugh, small and surprised, like it had caught even him off guard. Agreed, he said, and the word carried a warmth entirely different from the solemnity of the previous 3. They shook on it, the same way they had that first night in the dream desert, hands clasping firmly, sealing something that felt, in this moment, far more binding than any formal alliance either of their villages had ever signed. There it is, Shikaka murmured internally, something almost wistful in its usual grinding tone. An alliance neither village sanctioned, either village even knows exists. Rather poetic, don't you think, Fox? Rather dangerous, Kurama corrected, though even it couldn't entirely suppress something that, in a being less proud, might have been called reluctant approval. But yes. Perhaps also rather poetic. Time, unfortunately, has a way of moving faster than anyone wants it to when something precious is finally happening, and both boys were startled, somewhat later, by the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. Gaara went rigid immediately, head snapping toward the sound, every muscle tensing with practiced wariness. Patrol, he said quietly, urgently. That's not on the schedule I calculated. They must have adjusted the rotation. What do we do? Naruto asked, matching Gaara's sudden tension. We separate. Now, Gaara said, already scrambling to his feet, sand beginning to gather reflexively around his ankles as adrenaline sharpened his focus. If they see us together, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Naruto was already moving, scrambling back down the rocky outcropping toward the direction he'd come from, heart hammering with a fear entirely different from the earlier excitement. Wait, Naruto called back, pausing just long enough to look back at Gaara one last time. When? When do we meet again? I don't know, Gaara admitted, already retreating in the opposite direction, sand swirling faster around him as he prepared to draw on whatever reserves of chakra remained for another burst of speed. Soon, I promise soon. Soon, Naruto echoed, and then both boys were moving, Naruto scrambling back toward the academy field trip he'd slipped away from, praying desperately that Irika-sensei's ceremony narration had run long enough to cover his absence. Gaara pushing his half-recovered technique to its absolute limit, sand carrying him in an unstable, grainy blur back toward the training grounds and the guards he'd need to somehow slip back past without raising alarm. Behind them, a small Suna patrol crested the rise where the two boys had been sitting only moments before, scanning the empty overlook with the routine, unhurried thoroughness of shinobi following standard procedure, utterly unaware of just how close they'd come to discovering something that would have sent shockwaves through both villages. One of the patrol members paused, frowning slightly at the outcropping. "You feel that?" he asked his companion. "Chakra residue. Faint, but definitely here." His companion crouched, studying the scattered impressions in the sand, footprints, slightly too small to be adult-sized, and strange, swirling patterns that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. "Probably just kids from one of the border settlements," the second patrol member said after a moment's consideration. "Wandering out here where they shouldn't be. Nothing worth reporting." They moved on, resuming their routine sweep, entirely unaware of just how significant those small, scattered footprints actually were, unaware that they'd just missed, by mere minutes, evidence of a bond that would eventually reshape the futures of both their villages in ways neither could yet imagine. Naruto made it back to the academy group with barely 2 minutes to spare, slipping back into the loose formation just as Iruka-sensei began his final head count, breathless and flushed but otherwise undetected. "You okay, Naruto?" Iruka asked, noticing the slightly disheveled state of his student with mild concern. "You look like you've been running. Just excited about the field trip," Naruto said quickly, forcing a grin despite his still racing heart. "This diplomacy stuff is way more interesting than I thought it'd be." Iruka raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised by the enthusiasm. Naruto rarely showed much interest in diplomatic history lessons, but ultimately let the observation pass without further comment, chalking it up to one of the unpredictable quirks of an 8-year-old's attention span. Naruto spent the walk back to the academy in a state of quiet, giddy disbelief, replaying every detail of the meeting in his mind, already counting down the hours until sleep might carry him back into the dream space where he could tell Gaara, assuming Gaara had made it back safely too, just how incredible, how real, how right that meeting had felt. Gaara, meanwhile, made it back to the training grounds with considerably less margin for error, sand technique finally giving out entirely just outside the outer wall, leaving him to stumble the final stretch on foot, breathing hard, praying his guards hadn't noticed the gap in their supervision. He slipped back into the training grounds through the same gap he'd used to leave, straightening his clothes, forcing his breathing to steady, and had just managed to compose himself into something resembling calm when one of his assigned guards turned toward him with a slightly puzzled expression. "You've been quiet over there," the guard observed, studying Gaara with careful, professional scrutiny. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Gaara said, keeping his voice as flat and controlled as possible, though his heart still hammered from the exertion of the return journey. "Just practicing chakra control exercises." Quietly. The guard studied him a moment longer, something faintly suspicious flickering across his expression, before ultimately shrugging and turning back to his conversation with his fellow Chunin, apparently satisfied by the explanation. Gaara let out a slow, careful breath of relief, allowing himself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what had just happened, the risk he'd taken, the friendship he'd solidified, the strange, precious reality of having actually met, in person, the one person in the world who had ever made him feel like something other than a weapon to be managed and feared. "That was closer than I'd like," Shikaku observed internally, though there was less genuine concern in the assessment than there might have been weeks earlier. "But you managed it. Congratulations, kid. You just successfully committed treason against your own village's security protocols for the sake of a rice ball and a hug." "Worth it," Gaara thought back, and meant it entirely. "Yes," Shikaku admitted, something almost gentle threading through its usual grinding rasp. "I rather think it was." That night, when sleep finally carried both boys back into the familiar desert dreamscape, they found each other almost immediately, both practically bursting with the need to process everything that had happened. "That actually happened, right?" Naruto asked immediately, dropping down beside Gaara on their usual dune. "Like I'm not making it up. We actually met? In real life?" "We actually met," Gaara confirmed, and the small, genuine smile that crossed his face, steadier now than any smile he managed before, was answer enough. "That was the best day I've had in, like, ever," Naruto declared, flopping back onto the warm sand with theatrical satisfaction. "Well, best day since we started meeting in dreams, I guess. But this was different. This was, like, extra best." Extra best, Gaara repeated, something amused tugging at his mouth. Is that a real phrase? It is now, Naruto said, grinning up at the bruised sky. I'm making it official. Extra best. That's what today was. They talked long into the dream night, replaying every moment of the meeting with the particular joy of children savoring a precious secret, already beginning, carefully, cautiously, to plan when and how they might manage to meet again. Neither of them noticed, in the warmth of that moment, the subtle shift happening far beneath the surface of their bond, the way two ancient beasts, having witnessed their host's reckless, precious courage, had quietly, almost imperceptibly, moved one step closer to trusting each other again after centuries of separation. And neither of them noticed, either, the quiet unease beginning to stir far away in Sunagakure, where a young man named Yashimara had begun to notice small, strange details about his nephew's recent behavior that didn't quite add up. A slightly longer absence during training exercises than usual. A strange, unfamiliar warmth in Gaara's expression that hadn't been there before. A faint, lingering trace of chakra residue on his clothes that smelled, inexplicably, of somewhere far from the desert. Small details. Insignificant on their own. But details that would, in time, begin forming a pattern, one that would eventually force this fragile, secret alliance into its first real crisis. But that's a story for the chapters ahead. 2 weeks passed after the border meeting, 2 weeks of careful, cautious dream meetings, both boys still riding the quiet high of having proven, beyond any doubt, that their friendship existed outside the boundaries of sleep. But something had shifted in those 2 weeks too, something neither boy had quite named yet, though both of them felt it stirring at the edges of every conversation. Because ever since that first physical meeting, the ancient beast sealed inside them had grown steadily louder, more present, more willing to speak, as if the boy's courage in the waking world had somehow given the beasts themselves permission to stop hiding behind centuries of careful silence. It started small. A comment here, a stray thought there, bleeding through the thin membrane between conscious and subconscious in ways neither boy fully understood how to interpret. And then, on a warm evening roughly 2 weeks after the border meeting, it stopped being small entirely. Naruto had fallen asleep early that night, exhausted from a long day of academy training that had left his arms aching from repeated shuriken drills, and slipped into the familiar desert dreamscape with the easy, practiced comfort of someone who'd done this dozens of times now. Gaara was already there, sitting atop their usual dune, but something about his posture, tense, distracted, staring down at his own hands like they belonged to someone else, told Naruto immediately that something was different tonight. Hey, Naruto said, dropping down beside him with careful gentleness. You okay? You look kinda freaked out. Gaara didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strange, distant quality, like he was still only half present in the conversation. Shikaku's been talking more, he said slowly, the last few nights. Saying things I don't fully understand. About where it came from. About where I came from, I guess, in a way. Naruto's brow furrowed. The voice? The one that talks to you? Yes. Gaara finally looked up, pale eyes carrying an unusual weight of confusion mixed with something almost like fear. It said something tonight? Right before I fell asleep, it said, ask the boy about his fox. Ask him what the fox remembers. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up Naruto's spine. Because that name, fox, wasn't a word he'd ever used with Gaara. He'd mentioned the growling voice inside him plenty of times over the past weeks, but never once had he called it a fox. He hadn't even fully admitted to himself, not consciously, that the presence inside him might have a shape at all. How did it know that? Naruto asked quietly. I never told you it was a fox. Gaara shook his head slowly. I don't know. But it knew. It knew before you said anything. Deep beneath the surface of the dream, in the flooded chamber of its prison, Kurama's enormous eyes had already opened, watching this exchange unfold with the particular, focused intensity of something that had been waiting, patiently, deliberately, for exactly this moment to arrive. It seems the time for half measures has passed, the great fox rumbled, voice echoing through water that hadn't stirred in years. Shikaku has decided to force the issue. Reckless as ever. But perhaps it's not entirely wrong to do so. If you're just tuning in, this is where things start to get bigger than either of these boys realized when they first stumbled into each other's dreams. Because what's about to unfold tonight isn't just about two lonely kids finding comfort in a shared connection anymore. It's about a truth neither village has ever told them, a truth buried deep in the history of the entire shinobi world. Stick around, because this is the chapter where everything starts making a lot more sense, and a lot more dangerous. I think, Naruto said slowly, testing each word with unusual care, I think we should ask them. Whatever's inside us. I think we should just ask. Gaara looked at him, something uncertain flickering behind his tired eyes. Ask how? I don't even know how to talk to it properly. Most of the time it just happens. Words appear in my head, and I don't always understand where they come from. I don't know either, Naruto admitted. But maybe if we both try. Together. Maybe that's different than trying alone. Gaara considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a decision settling over his features. Okay, he said. Together then. They closed their eyes, an odd gesture within a dream already built from closed eyes, but one that felt instinctively right to both of them, and reached inward, toward the presence each of them had spent years learning to fear, learning to ignore, learning to live alongside without ever truly understanding. Hey, Naruto thought, tentative and a little embarrassed, feeling foolish even as he tried. Fox. If that's what you are. Gaara's, whatever's inside him, it said something about you, about what you remember. Can you? I don't know. Can you just tell us? For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, the dreamscape around them began to shift. The desert dissolved. Sand gave way to something else entirely. A vast, echoing space that felt neither quite like waking reality nor quite like the familiar dunescape they'd grown accustomed to. Naruto recognized fragments of it dimly, half-remembered flashes from nights he'd dreamed alone, before Gaara had ever entered his sleeping mind. A long, flooded corridor, stone walls streaked with moisture, an enormous iron-barred gate holding back something too large, too ancient, too dangerous to properly comprehend. Gaara, beside him, made a small sound of surprise, and Naruto realized, with a jolt that sent his heart racing, that they weren't in the shared desert dreamscape anymore. They were somewhere else, somewhere realer, somewhere closer to the actual heart of what lived inside each of them. Where are we? Gaara whispered. Somewhere you were never meant to see this young, a voice rumbled, low and enormous, echoing off flooded stone. But since you've asked so directly, and since my counterpart has apparently decided subtlety is no longer worth the effort, I suppose an explanation is owed. From the darkness beyond the massive iron gate, two enormous crimson eyes opened, and slowly, terribly, a shape began to resolve out of the shadows, vast, fox-like, for the deep red of dried blood, 9 long tails swaying slowly through the flooded chamber behind an impossibly large frame. Naruto's breath caught in his throat. He'd felt this presence before, in fragments, in growls, in half-remembered dream flashes he'd never fully understood. But seeing it, actually seeing the true shape of the thing that had lived inside him since before he could remember, hit differently than any vague sensation ever had. You're... Naruto started, voice barely above a whisper. Kurama, the great fox said, something almost weary in the way it offered its own name, like a burden being set down after too many years of carrying it silently. The nine-tailed fox, though I imagine you've heard other names for me. Less flattering ones, likely, given how your village speaks of what happened the night I was sealed inside you. Beside Naruto, Gaara had gone very still, staring past the iron bars at the enormous creature with an expression caught somewhere between fear and fascination. And you, Naruto said slowly, looking to his friend, is that what's inside you too? Something like this? Before Gaara could answer, another voice rasped through the flooded chamber, grating, uneven, carrying a chaotic energy entirely different from Kurama's weary gravity. Not quite like him, no, the voice said, and Naruto turned to see a second shape emerging from shadows on the opposite side of the massive space, smaller than Kurama, but no less unsettling, a hulking, sand-colored creature with a single tail and heavy-lidded, exhausted eyes that never seemed to fully close. Though we're closer kin than either of you probably realize. Named Shikaku, one-tailed, if titles matter to you. Gaara stared at the creature, the presence that had lived behind his eyes his entire short life, finally given shape and form, with something raw and overwhelmed working behind his pale face. "You're the voice," he said quietly. "The one that talks to me? That doesn't let me sleep properly." "Guilty," Shikaka said, without much apparent remorse. "Though in my defense, kid, that particular arrangement isn't entirely my doing. Blame the fool who designed your seal. But we'll get to that. Why are you showing us this now?" Naruto asked, gathering his courage, standing a little straighter despite the overwhelming presence looming beyond the iron bars. "You've never... I've heard growling before, but never like this. Never actually seeing you." Kurama's enormous eyes narrowed slightly, considering the question with obvious deliberation. "Because you asked?" the great fox finally said. "And because, whether I approve of the recklessness involved or not, the bond the two of you have built has already reached a point where half-truths and vague growling serve no one well. You deserve to understand, at least in part, what you're both connected to. What we all are connected to." "Speak for yourself with the reluctance, Fox," Shikaka interjected, something almost gleeful in its rasping tone. "I've been wanting to tell this story for years. Nobody ever wants to listen to me. Too busy being terrified, mostly." "There are reasons people fear you," Kurama said dryly, "beyond simple prejudice." "Details," Shikaka waved off with a dismissive gesture of one massive paw. Naruto glanced at Gaara, who offered a small, bewildered shrug, equally uncertain how to navigate this strange new dynamic between the two ancient beings. "Okay," Naruto said, turning back to face the iron bars fully. "So, tell us. What are you? Both of you, what are you actually? Why do you look kind of... I dunno. Related?" Kurama settled back onto its haunches, 9 tails curling slowly around its massive frame, and for a long moment, said nothing at all, as if gathering centuries of memory into something small enough to be spoken aloud to 2 8-year-old children. "A very long time ago," the great fox finally began, voice taking on a deeper, more resonant quality, like something reaching back through layers of accumulated years, before either of your villages existed, before the concept of hidden villages existed at all, there was a single being. Massive beyond anything either of you could properly imagine. A creature of pure, primordial chakra, born from the fusion of an ancient tree's fruit and the will of an entity known, in old records, as the 10 Tails. "The 10 Tails," Naruto repeated, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. "Like bigger than you?" "Considerably," Kurama confirmed. "A being of such overwhelming power that its very existence threatened to reshape the world entirely, indiscriminately, without malice or intention, simply through the sheer, uncontrolled force of what it was. It needed to be stopped. And it was stopped, eventually, by a man history remembers as the Sage of 6 Paths. The old man himself," Shikaka added, something almost fond in its tone despite the topic's gravity. "Sealed the beast inside his own body first. Became its jailer, in a manner of speaking, before eventually splitting its chakra into 9 separate pieces upon his death. 9 fragments of that original, overwhelming power, given shape, given will, given form. 9 pieces," Gaara said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn behind his pale eyes. "You mean..." "Yes," Kurama said. 9-tailed beasts, born from a single source. Myself. Shikaku. And 7 others scattered across the continent, sealed into various vessels over the centuries since, serving various purposes for various villages, weapons, deterrents, sources of power to be feared and controlled. "So you're..." Naruto trailed off, working through the implications slowly. "You're like brothers? Or, I don't know, is that the right word?" "Siblings, in the loosest possible sense," Kurama said. "Born from the same source, at the same moment, sharing a common origin that predates any of our individual identities, though family has always felt like too gentle a word for what actually happened to us." Something bitter crept into the great fox's voice, old resentment surfacing despite centuries of practiced restraint. "We were separated the moment we were created," Kurama continued. "Torn apart before we ever had the chance to understand what we were, scattered to different corners of the world, sealed into different vessels, forced to serve different masters. 9 pieces of a single whole, severed and set against each other by the very act of our creation." Gaara was quiet for a long moment, processing this, something complicated working behind his tired eyes. "So you and Shikaku," he finally said. "You're connected. From before either of you were even really separate things. Precisely, Shikaku said. Which explains, I imagine, why our reunion, however unlikely, however unplanned, happened as easily as it did. There's something in the chakra itself, a recognition buried deep, that persists even after centuries of separation. A recognition, Kurama echoed, something almost wistful creeping into its ancient voice despite obvious effort to maintain its usual gruff detachment, that I confess surprised even me, when I first felt Shikaku's presence bleeding through your dream, boy. I hadn't expected to feel anything at all. Centuries of isolation tend to numb a creature to most things. And yet, Shikaku agreed quietly. Naruto looked between the two enormous beings, something warm and important settling in his chest despite the strangeness of the entire conversation. So that's why, he said slowly, that's why Gaara and I keep ending up in the same dream. Because you two, you're connected. And somehow that connection reached out to us too. That is my working theory, yes, Kurama said. Though I confess the mechanics remain somewhat unclear even to me. Whether it was simple proximity of chakra signature, some lingering fragment of our shared origin, or something else entirely, I cannot say with certainty. Only that the bridge exists, and has, against all my careful instincts toward caution, continued to strengthen. Is that bad? Gaara asked quietly. That it's strengthening, I mean. There was a pause, a long one, weighted with something neither boy could quite interpret, before Kurama finally answered. I don't know, the great fox admitted, and something in the honesty of that admission carried more weight than any confident reassurance could have managed. It is unusual. It is, in many ways, unprecedented. I know of no record, in all my centuries of existence, of two Jinchūriki forming a bond quite like the one the two of you have built. It could be dangerous. It could destabilize the seals that contain us, given enough time and enough strain. Or it could simply be what it appears to be, two lonely children finding comfort in each other, aided by an old, buried connection between their tenants. Which do you think it is? Naruto pressed. Kurama was quiet for a long moment, crimson eyes studying the boy in front of it with something that, in a being less guarded, might have been called careful consideration. I think, the fox finally said, that I have watched you grow steadier, calmer, more resilient in the weeks since this bond began, boy. And I think Shikaku has observed something similar in its own host. Whatever risk this connection carries, it has, so far, done more good than harm. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps, worth protecting, carefully, cautiously, but worth protecting nonetheless. Something in Naruto's chest loosened at that admission, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it, the quiet reassurance of being told, by an ancient being who owed him nothing, that the thing he'd fought so hard to build wasn't simply reckless foolishness. Can I ask something? Gaara said quietly, drawing everyone's attention. When Kurama nodded, a slight, deliberate incline of its massive head, Gaara continued, choosing his words with obvious care. Shikaku said something before? About my seal being different. About it not letting me sleep. Is that connected to any of this? To what happened when you were split apart? Something shifted in Shikaku's posture, a subtle tension entering the beast's hulking frame, its heavy-lidded eyes narrowing slightly. That, the beast said slowly, is a somewhat more complicated story. And a considerably less pleasant one. Tell me anyway, Gaara said, quiet but firm. I want to understand. I deserve to understand, don't I? It's my own body. My own life. Kurama and Shikaku exchanged a long look, a silent, ancient communication passing between them that neither boy could fully interpret, before Shikaku finally, reluctantly, began to speak. Your seal is not like the boy's, Shikaku said, gesturing with one heavy paw toward Naruto. His containment, the 8-trigram seal, if the terminology means anything to either of you, was designed with considerable care. Complex. Balanced. Built to allow a proper connection between jailer and vessel, one that permits communication, cooperation, even trust, given enough time and effort. The beast's expression darkened, something old and bitter surfacing behind its exhausted eyes. Mine was not built with the same care, Shikaku continued. The seal binding me to you, boy, was constructed hastily, imperfectly, a rushed solution to an urgent political problem, rather than a carefully considered containment. It does not allow proper rest. It does not permit true balance between us. Every night, when you sleep, some part of my chakra bleeds forward, pressing against the edges of your consciousness, making true, restful sleep nearly impossible. Gaara's face had gone pale, understanding dawning with painful clarity. That's why, he said slowly. That's why I can never really rest. Even when I do sleep, it never feels like enough. Yes, Shikako confirmed, something almost gentle threading through its usual rough voice, an unexpected softness that seemed to surprise even the beast itself. I won't pretend the arrangement doesn't frustrate me as much as it clearly frustrates you, kid. I don't relish keeping you exhausted and fraying at the edges any more than you relish being kept that way. But the seal itself simply wasn't built to allow anything gentler. Can it be fixed? Naruto asked, glancing between Gaara and the two beasts with obvious concern. Like, is there a way to make it better? A different seal, or, perhaps, Kurama said slowly, considering the question with obvious care. Few ninjutsu of sufficient skill could theoretically reconstruct a more balanced containment, but such expertise is rare, and revealing the flaw in the current seal would require exposing far more about Gaara's condition than his village, or his family, currently seem willing to acknowledge. Something dark flickered behind Gaara's tired eyes at the mention of his family, a complicated tangle of emotion that neither boy fully addressed in that moment, though Naruto noted it carefully, filing it away the same way he'd filed away Gaara's earlier hesitation about Yashimaru weeks before. If you've been enjoying this deeper dive into the lore behind these two boys' connection, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on, because we've got a lot more ground to cover before this chapter's done, including a training breakthrough that's going to change how both these kids approach their abilities for years to come. Let's keep going. So what do we do? Naruto asked eventually, turning his attention back to the broader conversation, some of his earlier boyish energy returning despite the weight of everything he'd just learned. I mean, now that we know all this. What happens next? That, Kurama said, is rather up to the two of you, isn't it? I've shared what I know. The choice of what to do with that knowledge belongs to you both, not to me. Though I'll offer this much, Shikako added, something almost thoughtful entering its usual chaotic tone. Since the two of you are so determined to keep meeting, keep building whatever this alliance of yours has become, you might as well make it useful. Learn from each other. My host has abilities yours doesn't. Yours has training and discipline mine sorely lacks. Seems a waste not to share, given the risk you're both already taking simply to stay connected at all. Naruto's eyes lit up at that, some of the earlier heaviness of the conversation giving way to familiar, eager enthusiasm. Wait, seriously? Like you teach me stuff? Sand stuff? Gaara considered this, something thoughtful working behind his expression. I don't see why not, he said slowly. Though I don't know how much I could actually teach. My control over the sand is still developing. Unstable, in a lot of ways. That's fine, Naruto said quickly. I'm not exactly a master at anything either. We can just, I don't know, figure it out together. Like everything else we've done. Kurama observed this exchange with something that, on a less guarded creature, might have been the beginning of genuine approval. Perhaps, the great fox said slowly, there is value in this after all. Skills shared freely, without the political weight either village would attach to such an exchange. An education neither of you could receive through official channels. See, Fox? Shikako said, something triumphant in its rasping tone. Even you're coming around. Give it time. You might actually enjoy watching these two figure things out. Kurama said nothing to that, though its enormous crimson eyes, watching Naruto's excited expression, carried something that might, in a being less proud, have been mistaken for warmth. The dream space shifted then, sand and stone dissolving back into the familiar desert dunescape both boys had grown accustomed to, the flooded chamber and its two enormous inhabitants fading into something more distant, more contained, though the memory of what they'd just witnessed remained sharp and clear in both boys' minds. That was... Naruto trailed off, shaking his head slowly, still processing everything he'd just learned. That was a lot. Yes, Gaara agreed quietly. It was. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, both of them turning over the weight of what they'd just discovered, the shared origin of the beast sealed inside them. The ancient severance that had scattered 9 siblings across the world, the particular cruelty of Gaara's seal that Naruto found himself unable to fully set aside, some protective anger simmering quietly beneath his usual easy warmth. "Hey," Naruto said eventually, breaking the silence. "About what Shikaka said? About your seal. About it not letting you sleep properly." Gaara stiffened slightly, wariness returning to his posture. "What about it? Naruto hesitated, choosing his words carefully, unusual restraint for a boy who typically spoke first and thought later. "I'm sorry. That you have to deal with that. That doesn't seem fair." Something in Gaara's expression softened at the simple, unguarded sincerity of the statement. "It isn't," he agreed quietly. "But I've never really had a choice about it, so I've learned to live with it mostly." "You shouldn't have to just live with it, though," Naruto said, some fierce protectiveness creeping into his voice. "Maybe there's a way to fix it. Maybe if we..." "Naruto," Gaara interrupted gently. "I appreciate that. I do. But it's not something either of us can fix right now. Not with what we know, not with the resources we have. Maybe someday. But not now." Naruto's jaw tightened, frustration at the unfairness of it all clearly warring with the practical reality Gaara had just laid out. But eventually he nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Okay," he said. "But someday, though. When we're older, when we know more, someday we figure it out. Deal?" Gaara looked at him for a long moment, something moved and grateful working behind his tired eyes. "Deal," he said softly. They shifted the conversation after that, both of them clearly needing a lighter topic after the weight of everything they just processed, and settled instead into the training exchange Shikaka had suggested, trading small, careful lessons drawn from their very different upbringings. "Okay, so," Naruto said, sitting up straighter, chakra control. "That's, like, my worst subject at the academy. I've got tons of chakra, like, way more than anyone else in my class, according to Irika-sensei, but I can't control it for anything. I fail basically every control exercise we do." "What kind of exercises?" Gaara asked, curious. "Leaf-sticking stuff, mostly. You're supposed to put a leaf on your forehead and hold it there just using chakra, without using your hands. I can never get it right. Either I don't use enough and the leaf falls off, or I use too much, and it just kind of explodes off my forehead." Gaara considered this for a moment, brow furrowed in thought. "Show me," he said. "How you're doing it, I mean. Maybe I can see what's going wrong." Naruto closed his eyes, concentrating, drawing on the familiar sensation of chakra building somewhere in his core, and attempted, within the strange, malleable logic of the dream space, to demonstrate the exercise, a small imagined leaf appearing at his fingertips before he pressed it to his forehead, chakra flaring unevenly around it. The leaf, predictably, launched itself off his forehead within seconds, sailing several feet away on a small gust of overapplied chakra. Gaara studied the demonstration with careful, analytical focus. "You're not holding steady," he observed. "The chakra spikes and then drops, spikes and then drops. It's not that you can't control it, it's that you're trying to force it all at once instead of maintaining it evenly." "How do you know that?" Naruto asked, surprised. "Sand control works the same way," Gaara explained. "If I push too much chakra into the sand all at once, it just scatters uselessly. But if I maintain a steady, even pressure, like this," he demonstrated, drawing a small amount of sand from the dune beneath them, and within the dream space, the sand rose in a slow, controlled spiral around his hand, steady and unwavering, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of considerable practice despite Gaara's earlier claim of instability. "Whoa," Naruto breathed, watching the demonstration with genuine awe. "That's really cool. Okay, so steady. Even. Not all at once. Got it. I think." He tried again, this time consciously focusing on maintaining an even flow rather than forcing a sudden burst, and though the leaf still wobbled slightly, still threatened to slide free at the edges, it held, actually held, for several long seconds before finally slipping loose. "That's better," Gaara said, something like genuine satisfaction in his voice. "Much better than before." "That's, like, the longest I've ever held it," Naruto said, grinning wide. "Seriously, thanks. That actually helped." "You're welcome," Gaara said, and something in the simple exchange, the easy give and take of skill freely shared, free from any political weight or expectation, settled warm and comfortable between them. In turn, Naruto offered what he could of the more formal training discipline he'd absorbed through years of academy instruction, careful footwork drills, breathing techniques for maintaining focus under stress, the kind of structured, methodical practice that came from years of formal education, however imperfectly Naruto himself had absorbed it. You gotta breathe steady, he explained, demonstrating a slow, controlled breathing pattern Irika-sensei had drilled into the class repeatedly. Especially if you're gonna use a lot of chakra fast. If your breathing gets all messed up, your control gets messed up too. That's, like, rule 1 of basically everything at the academy. Gaara practiced the technique carefully, matching his breathing to the pattern Naruto demonstrated, and something in the deliberate, structured discipline of it seemed to genuinely calm something restless in his usual guarded posture. This helps, Gaara admitted after several minutes. I don't know exactly why, but it does. Irika-sensei says it's like a focus thing, Naruto said. Helps your mind and your chakra work together instead of fighting each other. Or something like that. I'm probably explaining it wrong, honestly. I don't pay attention in class as much as I should. You're explaining it well enough, Gaara said, something warm in his voice. I understand it. They continued trading small lessons back and forth for what felt, within the strange elastic time of the dream space. Like hours, Naruto absorbing fragments of Gaara's intuitive, sand-honed control. Gaara absorbing fragments of Naruto's formal, structured discipline, both of them growing steadily more skilled through the simple, precious act of teaching each other what they each already knew. Deep beneath the surface of their shared minds, Kurama and Shikaka watched this exchange with quiet, careful attention. You were right, it seems, Kurama admitted eventually, something grudging but genuine in the admission. There is value in this. More than I initially credited. Told you, Shikaka said, something smug threading through its grinding voice. 9 centuries of being locked in a cage teaches you a thing or two about recognizing when something good is actually happening, Fox. Even you can't argue with results. I make no promises about future arguments, Kurama said dryly, though there was less genuine resistance in the words than there might have been weeks earlier. But for tonight, I concede the point. Eventually, as it always did, the dream began to fade, the bruised sky above them shifting toward the pale streaks that signaled approaching wakefulness, the warm sand beneath them growing gradually less solid, less certain. Same time tomorrow? Naruto asked, the familiar question that had become their unofficial ritual over the past weeks. Same time tomorrow, Gaara confirmed, and then, hesitating slightly, added Naruto. Thank you? For today. For all of it, the training, the questions, the everything. Course, Naruto said, a little embarrassed by the sincerity but clearly pleased by it too. That's what friends do, right? Rule 3. We keep finding a way. Gaara smiled, small, but genuine, steadier now than it had been even a few weeks earlier. Rule 3, he agreed. The dream dissolved around them, sand scattering into golden light, and both boys drifted back toward their separate waking realities, minds full of ancient histories and shared techniques. Hearts a little lighter for having faced something enormous together, and come through it stronger, not weaker. Naruto woke the next morning with the unusual, lingering clarity of a dream that had felt more significant than most, staring up at his apartment's cracked ceiling, processing everything he'd learned the night before. Kurama, he thought, testing the name silently, feeling out its weight now that it belonged to something real, something he'd actually seen. That's your name. Kurama, deep within him. In the flooded chamber of its prison, the great fox stirred faintly at the acknowledgement, though it offered no verbal response, simply a low, quiet rumble, something that might, in a creature capable of such things, have been the ghost of acknowledgement. Naruto smiled faintly at the ceiling, an unfamiliar warmth settling in his chest, the particular warmth of understanding something about himself that had, until very recently, remained a frightening, unexplained mystery. Hundreds of miles away, in Sunagakure, Gaara woke to a similar quiet clarity, though his morning carried a heavier undercurrent of concern that Naruto's had not. Because as he sat up in bed, reaching automatically for the stuffed bear that had, over recent weeks, begun feeling less necessary as a source of comfort now that he had something realer, something better, he noticed his bedroom door already standing open, and Yashimaru standing in the doorway, watching him with an expression Gaara couldn't quite read. You were talking in your sleep last night, Yashimaru said quietly, something careful and measured in his tone that hadn't been there in previous mornings. Names I didn't recognize. Kurama. Naruto. A pause, weighted and deliberate. Who are they, Gaara? Gaara's blood ran cold, every careful precaution of the past weeks suddenly feeling perilously thin. I don't remember, he said quickly, too quickly, and saw something shift almost imperceptibly behind his uncle's gentle eyes, not quite suspicion yet, but something adjacent to it, something newly, carefully attentive. You don't remember, Yashimaru repeated slowly, and though his voice remained soft, though his expression remained composed in its usual practiced kindness, something in the quality of his attention had changed, sharper now, more focused, the careful watchfulness of someone who had just noticed a thread worth pulling. I should get ready for training, Gaara said, standing quickly, needing to escape the weight of that careful, assessing gaze. Yashimaru nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him pass, but as Gaara moved toward the door, his uncle's quiet voice followed him. Be careful, Gaara, Yashimaru said softly. Whatever it is you're keeping from me, I only want to help. Remember that. Gaara paused in the doorway, something cold and uncertain settling in his stomach despite the apparent gentleness of the words. I know, he said quietly, and left, unable to shake the sense that something had shifted that morning, something small, subtle, but undeniably significant. Behind him, alone in the quiet bedroom, Yashimaru remained still for a long moment, his expression settling into something considerably less gentle than the one he'd shown his nephew, before turning and making his way toward his own quarters, already composing, in his careful, methodical mind, the report he would need to prepare for the following week. Yashimaru did not confront his nephew again in the days that followed. That, in some ways, made everything worse. Gaara had braced himself for questions, for the careful, probing follow-ups he'd expected after that unsettling morning conversation, for Yashimaru pressing further on the names he'd murmured in his sleep. Instead, his uncle simply continued as before, preparing tea each evening, checking in on his training, offering the same practiced gentleness that had defined their relationship for as long as Gaara could remember. But something had shifted. Gaara felt it in small, almost imperceptible ways. The half-second longer Yashimaru's gaze lingered on him during breakfast, the careful, deliberate way his uncle now phrased certain questions about his days, questions that had once been casual and were now, Gaara suspected, calculated. How was training today? Yashimaru asked one evening, setting down a tray with 2 cups of warm ginger tea, the steam curling gently between them. Fine, Gaara said carefully. Nothing unusual. No new friends? Nothing interesting happening? The question was light, almost teasing in tone, but something beneath it carried weight Gaara couldn't quite name. No, Gaara lied, and hated how easily it came out, hated the small, guilty twist in his stomach that followed. Yashimaru studied him for a moment longer than felt comfortable, then smiled. The same gentle, practiced smile Gaara had known his entire life, and let the matter drop. Drink your tea before it gets cold, he said, and left the room. Gaara sat alone afterward, staring down at the cup, appetite suddenly gone. He's watching you more closely, Shikaku observed quietly from somewhere deep inside him, none of its usual chaotic humor present in the assessment. Have you noticed? I've noticed, Gaara thought back grimly. Careful, then, Shikaku said. Whatever's happening, whatever he suspects, it's not nothing. I don't like the way his chakra shifted, just now. Small, but real. Like a man preparing for something. That night, when sleep finally carried Gaara into the dream desert, he found Naruto already waiting on their dune, and something in his friend's expression, an eagerness, an easy, unburdened happiness, made the weight sitting in Gaara's chest feel even heavier by contrast. Hey! Naruto said, grinning as Gaara settled beside him. So I actually managed to hold that leaf on my forehead for almost a full minute today. A whole minute! Iruka-sensei looked at me like I'd grown a second head or something. That's good, Gaara said, and meant it, though the words came out flatter than he intended. Naruto's grin faltered slightly, perceptive enough after weeks of friendship to catch the shift in tone. You okay? You seem kinda off tonight. Gaara hesitated. Rule 1 sat heavy in his mind, keep this secret. From everyone, no exceptions. But Yashimaru wasn't everyone. Yashamara was supposed to be safe, and yet something about voicing his growing unease felt dangerous in a way he couldn't quite articulate, as if speaking the fear aloud might somehow make it more real. My uncle, Gaara finally said. He heard me say your names in my sleep. Yours. Kurama's. He's been different since then. Watching me more carefully, asking questions that feel like they're testing something. Naruto's easy grin disappeared entirely, replaced by something serious and immediately alert. Do you think he knows? Like, actually knows, not just suspects something? I don't know, Gaara admitted. I don't think so. Not yet. But he's not going to stop paying attention now. I know him well enough to understand that much. What do we do? Naruto asked, and the we in that question, automatic, unhesitating, entirely without consideration of whether this was really Naruto's problem to help solve, settled something warm and steadying in Gaara's chest despite the fear still coiled there. I don't know that either, Gaara admitted. Maybe we're more careful. Maybe we stop meeting so often, for a while, until he loses interest. Something flickered across Naruto's face. Reluctance, clearly, the thought of pulling back from something that had become one of the few genuinely good things in his life clearly unwelcome. But after a moment, he nodded slowly. If that's what keeps you safe, he said quietly, then yeah. Okay. We can be more careful. Deep beneath the surface, Kurama had been listening to this exchange with characteristic focus, and now, unprompted, its low, rumbling voice pushed forward into the conversation. A word of caution, if either of you will hear it, the great fox said. Pulling back entirely may prove more dangerous than continuing carefully. A sudden, complete absence of whatever behavior your uncle has noticed might read as more suspicious than a gradual, natural fading, assuming he is, as you suspect, actively watching for confirmation rather than simply passing curiosity. So what, we just keep meeting like normal? Naruto asked, brow furrowed. Not quite, Kurama said. I suggest moderation. Fewer meetings, perhaps, but not a complete cessation. And Gaara, the fox's massive attention shifted, focusing on the boy directly. You might consider offering your uncle something. Not the truth, not anything close to it, but some plausible, mundane explanation for the names, for the change in your behavior. Something that satisfies curiosity without inviting deeper investigation. Gaara considered this carefully, turning the strategy over with the same methodical precision he brought to most difficult problems. Like what? That is rather up to you, Kurama said. You know your uncle. You know what he might find believable. I merely suggest the principle, give him something to hold on to, so he stops reaching for more. Gaara nodded slowly, something settling into calm, deliberate calculation behind his tired eyes. The same careful precision that had once mapped patrol routes and escape windows now turning toward a considerably more delicate problem. I'll think of something, he said quietly. If you're wondering why we're spending so much time on quiet conversations instead of big, flashy training montages, trust the process. Because everything unraveling in this chapter, everything about to go wrong, traces back to small moments just like this one. The kind of moments that feel manageable in the room, and turn out, later, to have been the beginning of something much bigger. Keep watching. It's about to get a lot more complicated. 3 days later, Gaara found his opportunity. Yashamara had settled into his usual evening ritual. Tea prepared, tray set carefully on the nightstand. The same gentle inquiry about Gaara's day that had, over recent evenings, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of careful assessment. How was training? Yashamara asked, settling into his usual spot at the edge of the bed. Good, Gaara said, and then, before his uncle could move on, added, with careful, rehearsed casualness, I met someone. During one of the border patrol drills. A merchant's kid, from one of the caravan routes. We got to talking a little, while the adults were handling the formal exchange. Yashamara went very still, something careful and attentive settling over his expression. A merchant's child, he repeated slowly. From Konoha? I think so, Gaara said, keeping his voice deliberately light, deliberately uncertain. I didn't ask too many questions. His name was Naruto. Seemed nice enough. A little strange, maybe, but nice. He paused, as if considering something. I think I might have talked about him in my sleep. Is that what you heard? The names? It was, he knew, a risky gambit, offering a partial truth wrapped around a convenient lie, hoping the plausibility of the explanation would satisfy his uncle's suspicion without inviting deeper scrutiny. He held his breath, watching Yashimaru's careful expression for any sign of doubt. For a long moment, his uncle said nothing, simply studying him with that same measured attention that had characterized recent days. And then, slowly, something in his posture eased. Not fully, not entirely, but enough that Gaara felt a small, cautious relief begin unwinding the tension in his chest. A merchant's child, Yashimaru said again, softer this time. That explains the names, I suppose? Kurama, though, is that his family name? Or a nickname of some kind? I'm not sure, Gaara said, careful to maintain the same easy uncertainty. I didn't ask. We only talked for a little while. Yashimaru nodded slowly, and though something in his expression still carried a faint, lingering trace of careful watchfulness, the sharper edge of suspicion that had defined recent days seemed, for the moment at least, to have dulled. Well, he said, standing, gathering the tea tray with practiced ease. It's good you're making friends, even briefly. You don't get enough chances for that. A pause, and then, quieter, just be careful, Gaara. Border interactions with foreign children aren't exactly sanctioned, even innocent ones. If the council learn, I know, Gaara said quickly. It won't happen again. I mean, I probably won't see him again anyway. It's not like the caravans come through that often. Yashimaru studied him a moment longer, then nodded, something in his expression settling into something closer to his usual gentle warmth. Get some rest, he said, and left the room. Gaara sat alone afterward, letting out a long, careful breath, the tension of the past several days finally beginning to ease. Well handled, Shikaku observed, something like genuine approval threading through its usual chaotic tone. Though I'd advise caution going forward. That kind of relief is exactly the moment people tend to get careless. I know, Gaara thought back, settling into bed, exhaustion from the careful performance finally catching up with him. I'll be careful. What Gaara didn't know, what neither he nor Naruto had any way of knowing, tucked away as they were in the relative safety of their dream space and careful lies, was that Yashimaru's relief was considerably more fragile, and considerably more calculated, than it appeared. Because later that same night, in a small, private office deep within Sunagekyu's administrative district, Yashimaru sat across from a stern-faced council elder, a woman named Chio, whose careful, measured questions carried none of the gentle warmth Yashimaru had shown his nephew only hours before. The child mentioned a name, Yashimaru reported, voice clipped and professional, entirely different from the soft cadence he used around Gaara. Kurama. He claimed it belongs to a merchant boy he met near the border. But I confess the explanation felt convenient. Too neatly wrapped around whatever the boy is actually hiding. Chio's weathered face remained impassive, though something sharp flickered behind her eyes. Kurama, she repeated slowly, testing the word. That's not a common name, not one I've heard associated with any merchant families along the border routes. She paused, considering. You're certain the boy's behavior has changed? Beyond simple childhood friendship? Certain, Yashimaru confirmed. He sleeps more soundly than I've ever witnessed. His chakra control during supervised exercises has improved noticeably in recent weeks, improvements that don't align with his usual training schedule, and there was a discrepancy in his guard rotation several weeks ago. A gap, brief but real, that neither assigned guard could fully account for. Chio was quiet for a long moment, weighing this information with obvious care. You suspect he's been leaving the village? Meeting someone. I suspect, Yashimaru said carefully, that whatever is happening deserves closer observation before we draw firm conclusions. If the boy has genuinely found some source of stability, however unorthodox its origin, disrupting it carelessly could prove counterproductive to the council's broader concerns about his condition. Something calculating settled behind Chio's weathered eyes. And if this source of stability proves to be something more concerning? Something connected to the tenet sealed within him, rather than simple childhood friendship? Yashimaru hesitated, something complicated flickering behind his own carefully composed expression, a hesitation that, had anyone been paying closer attention, might have revealed considerably more about his own conflicted feelings toward his nephew than his professional report suggested. Then, he said finally quietly, The council will need to decide how best to address it. But I would ask that we proceed carefully. He's still a child, whatever else he might carry within him. Chio studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her expression, before finally nodding. Continue your observations, she said. Report anything further you notice. And Yashimaru, she paused, weight settling into her tone. The council's patience with this particular situation is not unlimited. You understand what's at stake if his instability worsens rather than improves. I understand, Yashimaru said quietly, and left the room with considerably more weight settled on his shoulders than he'd carried entering it. Neither Gaara nor Naruto knew anything about this conversation, knew nothing of the careful, calculating machinery already beginning to turn in the shadows of Sunegakure's council chambers. For the next several days, their careful moderation seemed to be working exactly as Kurama had predicted, meetings less frequent, conversations shorter, both boys maintaining a careful, deliberate restraint that, for the moment, seemed to be easing whatever suspicion had gathered around them. But restraint, as both boys would soon learn, carries its own particular difficulty when the thing being restrained is one of the only genuine comforts either of them has ever known. It was nearly a week later when things began, quietly and without warning, to shift. Naruto noticed at first a strange, unsettling quality to the dream space one evening, the familiar warmth of the desert sand replaced by something colder, more chaotic, sand swirling in agitated, uneven patterns that mirrored nothing he'd witnessed before. Gaara? He called out, scanning the churning landscape with growing concern. Gaara, where are you? He found his friend eventually, curled at the base of their usual dune rather than sitting atop it, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, an unfamiliar tremor running through his small frame. Hey, Naruto said, dropping down beside him immediately, alarm sharpening every word. Hey, what's wrong? What happened? Gaara didn't answer immediately, and when he finally lifted his head, something raw and frightened flickered behind his pale eyes, an expression Naruto had never witnessed from his friend before, not even during their most vulnerable conversations. Something's wrong, Gaara said, voice unsteady. With Shikaka. I can feel it, pressing harder than usual. Angrier. I don't understand why. Deep beneath the surface, Naruto felt Kurama stir with sudden, sharp attention, the great fox's presence pressing forward with unusual urgency. Something's happening in Sunegakure, Kurama said, voice carrying an edge Naruto had rarely heard from the ancient beast. I can sense it through the connection to Shikaku. Agitation, distress, something building toward crisis. Boy, I need you to listen carefully. Whatever is happening to your friend right now, it's happening in the waking world, not merely in this dream. What do you mean? Naruto asked, fear sharpening his voice. What's happening to him? I don't know, Kurama admitted, and the honesty of that uncertainty carried its own kind of dread. But Shikaku's chakra is destabilizing rapidly. If this continues unchecked, it could overwhelm the boy's conscious control entirely. Naruto turned back to Gaara, whose breathing had grown increasingly ragged, whose small frame had begun trembling more visibly, sand churning in increasingly violent patterns around them. Gaara, hey, look at me, Naruto said, gripping his friend's shoulders with both hands, forcing eye contact despite the growing chaos around them. Whatever's happening, we're gonna figure it out. Okay? You're not alone in this. I can't. Gaara's voice cracked, something desperate and frightened bleeding through his usual careful composure. I can't control it. It's too strong. It's never been this strong before. This is exactly the kind of moment this series exists to build toward, the point where a secret alliance forged in quiet, careful dream meetings has to prove whether it actually means something when things go wrong. Because right now, hundreds of miles apart, in a dream neither village sanctioned, two ancient beasts and two frightened children are facing down something that could end everything they've built. If this story's got you on the edge of your seat, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's find out what happens next. Kurama, Naruto said, urgent and pleading, you gotta help him. Please. There's gotta be something we can do. For a long, tense moment, the great fox said nothing, its enormous presence seeming to calculate something with careful, deliberate focus. There may be something, Kurama finally said. A technique, old, half-remembered from a time before either of us were separated from our shared origin. A method of steadying agitated chakra through direct resonance, rather than direct suppression. It carries risk. I've never attempted it in circumstances quite like these. But it may be our best option. Do it, Naruto said immediately, without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Very well, Kurama said, and something in its ancient voice carried unusual weight, unusual gravity. Boy, I need you to focus. Channel calm, steady chakra, not toward yourself, but toward the connection linking your mind to Gaara's. Trust me to guide the rest. Naruto nodded, closing his eyes despite the chaos still churning around them, drawing on the same steady, even breathing technique he taught Gaara weeks earlier, focusing every ounce of concentration on the fragile, precious bridge connecting his mind to his friends. Slowly, carefully, he felt something shift, Kurama's presence flowing outward through him, through the dream bridge, reaching toward the agitated, destabilized chakra churning at Shikaka's edges. It felt, Naruto would later try to describe it, like reaching through fire to grab something drowning in water, dangerous, uncertain, but necessary. Steady, Kurama murmured, its ancient voice taking on a strange, resonant quality that seemed to echo through the entire dreamscape. Shikaku. Old kin, whatever has agitated you, whatever crisis is building in the waking world, your host cannot weather this alone. Draw on me, if you must. Draw on the resonance between us, let it steady what threatens to break. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The sand continued churning violently around them, Gaara's trembling growing more pronounced, his breathing increasingly ragged and desperate. And then, slowly, impossibly, something began to shift. Fine, Shikaku's voice finally rasped through the chaos, strained and uneven but unmistakably present. Fine. If this is what it takes. The chaotic swirling of sand around them began, gradually, to slow, not stopping entirely, but easing, the violent patterns giving way to something calmer, more controlled. Gaara's trembling eased with it, his ragged breathing slowly steadying, color returning gradually to his pale, frightened face. What just happened? Gaara finally managed, voice still shaky but considerably steadier than moments before. A temporary stabilization, Kurama said, and Naruto could sense, even without fully understanding the mechanics of what had just occurred, that the ancient fox's voice carried unusual exhaustion, unusual strain. Borrowed from the resonance between myself and Shikaku. It will not last indefinitely, and it does not address whatever crisis is building in your waking world, boy. But it should hold long enough for you to wake safely, and to understand that something in Sunageki requires your immediate attention. Gaara sat up slowly, still shaken, still processing the frightening intensity of what had just occurred. Naruto's steady grip on his shoulders the only thing keeping the last vestiges of panic from fully overwhelming him. Thank you, he said quietly, looking between Naruto and the vast, distant presence of Kurama he could sense but not fully see. Both of you. I don't know what would have happened if. Don't, Naruto said firmly, cutting him off. Don't think about that. We're gonna figure out what's causing this, and we're gonna fix it. Okay? Gaara nodded slowly, something fragile but genuine steadying behind his tired eyes. I need to wake up, he said. Whatever's happening, Kurama's right, it's happening out there, not just in here. I need to understand what it is. Be careful, Naruto said, worry evident in every word. Please. Whatever you find out there, be careful. I will, Gaara promised, and the dream began to dissolve around them, sand scattering into strange, uncertain light, both boys' minds pulling reluctantly back toward their separate waking realities. Gaara's eyes snapped open in the darkness of his bedroom, heart still racing from the intensity of what he'd just experienced, and it took him several long moments to orient himself, to distinguish dream from reality. The room was quiet. Too quiet, somehow, in a way that felt wrong rather than peaceful. He sat up slowly, listening carefully, and after a moment, caught the faint, distant sound of voices, hushed, urgent, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. His uncle's voice, and another he didn't immediately recognize, sharp and clipped in a way that carried unmistakable authority. Careful, quiet, drawing on every instinct of stealth he developed through weeks of careful border-crossing preparation, Gaara slipped from his bed and crept toward his bedroom door, easing it open just enough to catch fragments of the conversation carrying down the hallway. The council's decision, not mine to override, Yashimaru was saying, his voice carrying a tension Gaara had rarely heard from his usually composed uncle. But I've expressed my concerns multiple times. Your concerns are noted, the other voice replied, clipped, professional, unmistakably the voice Gaara had occasionally heard mentioned in passing as belonging to one of the village's senior council members. But the boy's instability continues to pose a risk the council cannot simply ignore. Whatever temporary stability you've observed recently doesn't change the fundamental calculation. If anything, it raises new questions about what's causing the shift, questions that demand answers, not simply relief that the immediate symptoms have eased. Gaara's breath caught, cold dread pooling in his stomach. What exactly is the council proposing? Yashimaru asked, and something in his voice, careful, guarded, but unmistakably tense, suggested he already suspected an answer he didn't want to hear. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, before the council member finally answered. Closer observation for now. But if the instability worsens, if what happened tonight repeats, or escalates, another pause, colder this time, the council will need to consider more permanent solutions. You understand what that might mean, Yashimaru? Better than most. Gaara stood frozen in his doorway, every word settling into his chest like ice, the careful, warm relief he'd felt only minutes before in the dream now replaced by something far colder, far more frightening. Permanent solutions. He didn't fully understand what those words meant, not yet, not with the full weight their eventual implication would carry. But something instinctive, something buried deep in the careful watchfulness he'd learned to maintain his entire short life, told him it wasn't anything good. He retreated back to his bed, sitting in the darkness, heart still racing, mind spinning through everything he just overheard. You heard that, Shikaku said quietly, none of its usual chaotic energy present in the observation. I heard, Gaara thought back, fear and confusion tangling together in his chest. What did they mean? Permanent solutions, what does that mean? Shikaku was quiet for a long, uncomfortable moment. I don't know precisely, it finally admitted. But councils that fear what they've sealed inside a child rarely mean anything gentle by such phrasing. Be careful, kid. Whatever's building here, it's bigger than a simple misunderstanding your uncle can smooth over with careful conversation. Gaara sat alone in the darkness for a long time afterward, sleep entirely elusive despite the exhaustion still lingering from the earlier crisis, turning over the fragments of conversation he'd overheard, trying and failing to fully understand the scope of the danger apparently gathering around him. Naruto, meanwhile, woke abruptly in his own small apartment, breathing hard, heart pounding with residual fear from the crisis he'd just witnessed, unable to shake the image of Gaara, trembling and frightened, unable to fully control something ancient and dangerous churning inside him. He lay awake for a long while, staring at his ceiling, worry gnawing at his chest. Please be okay, he thought, though he had no way of knowing whether the thought reached anywhere beyond his own restless mind. Please be okay. He didn't sleep again that night, not properly, not restfully, and the next morning, exhausted and distracted, he found himself unable to fully focus during academy lessons. Iruka-sensei's voice fading into indistinct background noise as his mind churned anxiously over everything that had happened. Naruto, Iruka's voice finally cut through his distraction, sharp enough to startle him upright in his seat. Is something wrong? You've been distracted all morning. I'm fine, Naruto said quickly, too quickly, the same reflexive deflection Gaara had used on his own uncle only days before. Iruka studied him for a moment, brow furrowed with genuine concern. You don't seem fine. Did something happen? And here, in a small, unguarded moment of exhaustion and worry, Naruto very nearly said something he shouldn't have. It's just, he started, the words nearly slipping free before he caught himself, some instinctive, last-second restraint kicking in. It's just, a friend. I'm worried about a friend. Iruka's expression softened slightly, concern easing into something gentler. What kind of worried? I don't really know, Naruto admitted, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. Something's wrong, and I can't really help from here. It's complicated. Well, Iruka said slowly, sometimes the best thing you can do for a friend going through something difficult is just let them know you're there. Even if you can't fix whatever's wrong, knowing someone cares makes a difference. More than you might think. Naruto nodded slowly, something in the simple, sincere advice settling gently into his worried chest. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, okay. Iruka studied him a moment longer, clearly sensing there was more to the story than Naruto was sharing, but ultimately let the matter drop, returning his attention to the lessons still waiting to be taught. Naruto spent the rest of the day in a similar state of distracted worry, counting down the hours until sleep might finally carry him back into the dream space, desperate to know whether Gaara was truly okay. We're getting close to the heart of this crisis now, and I want you to sit with something for a second, because everything happening in Senogeki right now, everything building toward whatever permanent solutions that council member was hinting at, isn't happening in isolation. It's tangled up directly with the bond these two boys have built. Their alliance didn't cause this crisis, but it's about to become impossible to separate from it. If you're invested in seeing how this plays out, make sure that subscribe button's hit, because we're not slowing down from here. That night, when sleep finally carried both boys back into the familiar dream desert, Naruto found Gaara waiting for him, looking exhausted but steadier than the crisis of the previous night had left him. "You're okay," Naruto breathed, relief flooding through him as he dropped down beside his friend. "I was so worried." "What happened? What was going on?" Gaara hesitated, weighing how much to share, before finally deciding, perhaps unwisely, perhaps not, but decisively, that Naruto deserved to know the truth. "I overheard something," he said quietly. "After I woke up. My uncle, talking with someone from the council. They were talking about me. About Shikaku destabilizing." He paused, something heavy and frightened settling into his voice. "They mentioned something called permanent solutions if things get worse. I don't know exactly what that means. But it didn't sound good." Naruto's face went pale, something protective and furious flickering behind his usual easy warmth. "Permanent solutions," he repeated slowly. That sounds really bad, Gaara." "I know," Gaara said quietly. "What are we gonna do?" Naruto asked, and again, that automatic we, unhesitating, unconditional, entirely without question of whether this was his burden to help carry. Gaara was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the same careful precision he brought to every difficult problem, before finally answering. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know I need to be more careful. Not just about us, about everything. My control, my behavior, everything the council might be watching for reasons to worry." "A wise instinct," Kurama's voice rumbled quietly, its presence settling into the conversation with careful, deliberate gravity. "But caution alone may not be sufficient, given what you've just described. If the council genuinely believes drastic measures might become necessary, careful behavior alone will not fully address whatever fear is driving that consideration." "Then what will?" Gaara asked, frustration and fear bleeding through his usual careful composure. "I don't know yet either," Kurama admitted, and the honesty of that uncertainty settled heavy and uncomfortable over the entire dream space. "But we have time to think, to plan, to prepare, assuming tonight's crisis doesn't repeat itself before we manage it. That, I suspect, will require more of your combined effort than either of you have yet needed to offer this bond." They sat together for a long while after that, the earlier warmth of their friendship now tempered by genuine, shared fear, the first real crisis this fragile alliance had faced, and a stark, sobering reminder that the stakes underlying their connection ran far deeper than either of them had fully appreciated when it all began with a simple shared dream on a lonely birthday. "Hey," Naruto said eventually, breaking the heavy silence. "Whatever happens, whatever the council decides, whatever we have to figure out, you're not facing it alone. Okay? I don't care how far apart we are. I don't care how careful we have to be. I'm not going anywhere." Gaara looked at him, something fierce and grateful and frightened all tangled together behind his tired eyes. "Neither am I," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." They sat together beneath the strange, bruised sky, two lonely children carrying burdens neither of their villages fully understood, bound together by an ancient connection neither of them had asked for but both had come, fiercely, unconditionally, to treasure, unaware that hundreds of miles away, in a quiet administrative office in Senogeki, a decision was already being quietly, carefully set into motion, one that would, in the weeks ahead, test this fragile alliance more brutally than either boy could yet imagine. "So, what did you think?" A crisis nearly overwhelming Shikaku's fragile containment, an ancient resonance between Kurama and Shikaku offering just enough stability to pull Gaara back from the edge, and a chilling glimpse into just how seriously Sunegakure's council is starting to view the instability building inside their young Jinchūriki. Permanent solutions. Sit with that phrase for a second. Because we all know, if you've followed Gaara's story before, exactly what kind of history that phrase is edging toward, and in this timeline, it's arriving faster, and under circumstances neither Naruto nor Gaara fully understand yet. Do you think Yashimaru will keep pushing back against the council? Do you think this crisis is going to force Naruto and Gaara into a decision neither of them is ready to make?